This episode is dedicated to the lives of Aisha Hudson, Rodney Nastis, Neil Stonechild, Lawrence Wegner, Kenneth Chamberlain, Dante Wright, Rayshard Brooks, Daniel Prude, Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, Ora Rosser, Stephen Clark, Botham Jean, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Dontre Hamilton, Freddie Gray, Janisha Fonville, Daniel Shaver, Eric Garner, Michelle Cousseau, Akai Gurley, Gabriela Navarez, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, Jamel Floyd, Sean Monterosa, and Justin Howell. There are many more who have died at the hands of police that it would be impossible to recount them all here and now. And if I could read them all, I would. But this episode is dedicated to everybody.
You are listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. On this episode, we're discussing the song Pigs Will Pay, the A-side on the How to Clean a Couple of Things 7-inch from Fat Records.
I'm really excited we're talking about this one because we haven't talked about either one of the songs off this 7-inch yet. The other one being Stick the Flag, of course. But, to start off this conversation, this is going to be a heavy one for us, I think, Keith. Are you kind of feeling that way? Are you kind of feeling the weight of the topic here?
There's a lot of pressure, and I had to make little notes and addendums for everything that I couldn't talk about to address in future episodes. So if you're listening and people are wondering why we didn't talk about this, well, please give us feedback. But let you know, like there's no way to really cover everything that meaningfully needs to be covered in talking about a topic like police violence.
Yeah, there's a podcast I've been listening to recently that covers police violence in a extreme amount of detail. So if anybody out there is looking for more information on this, obviously you're not going to get it from us. We're just a couple of guys talking about music and a band on a podcast. Like we take this show seriously, but there are people out there who know so much more than us. Yeah. So a really good starting point, I think, for people would be the podcast Behind the Bastards. That podcast is amazing. There's an episode that I specifically recommend about that horrible person, Dave Grossman's police trainings, where he goes over the killology theory that he's developed. Killology. That's like literally the name of this person's training who trains police departments across the whole entire country. So that's a really important one. Behind the Bastards. Another is a new book out called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. And you can actually get that as a free download right now. So if you go to Alex Vitale's Twitter page, you can find a link to the ebook download from Verso Press. And I downloaded it the other day. I posted a link to it on our Twitter. So I would highly recommend that people go and get that fantastic resource. It's also available as an audiobook for people who, like to quote unquote read while doing other things, like such as like going on long runs or whatever. But you can't rely on you and me on this podcast about propaganda songs to cover the totality of this topic. So it's a massive disclaimer, but we have to say it.
Yeah, I feel like this is a starting point for myself. This is not an end point for anybody else.
I've never been the victim of any kind of police mistreatment other than rudeness and dismissiveness and, suspicion and, looking at me sideways. But I am who I am. And I I was telling Keith, like I've gotten away with plenty of things in my life, but I've never been on the receiving end of a catastrophe at the hands of police, essentially. So all of the things that we're going to talk about, I mean, it's my observations with regards to this topic. But before we dive into this super heavy stuff, I have some information on the record. So I feel like maybe I'll kind of like start us off a little bit light, and then we'll kind of ease our way towards the heaviness. But man, I tell you what, after reading that introduction dedication earlier, I was shaking. Like just reading this infinite list of names of human lives who have been taken at the hands of police, many of whom are completely unarmed, just normal people like going about their lives, and find their lives snuffed out just on a random day, a completely random day. So it's this has been a heavy one for me today thinking about this. It's been a heavy couple of weeks. It's been a heavy year in the United States for police violence. I mean, we're going through some major stuff as a country, and we always are, is the thing. But like, you know, with the last week's conviction of Derek Chauvin, it's such a symbolic moment in so many ways, but we'll get into that. But before we get there, I got a little information on this record. I know I already said that, but I'm saying it again. So, and I don't mean for this to detract from the seriousness of this topic, but you know, this record is essentially a standalone release on Fat Records. It's their second release after How to Clean Everything came out. A few months passes, and this 7-inch comes out, and it came out with 1,520 copies on orange vinyl. It's like clear orange, like almost like pea colored. There's also black versions. There are reissue versions on black vinyl with no insert. And the insert is such an absolutely fantastic thing that if you're out there shopping for used copies of this, try to find one with the insert, because the band's early days inserts are hilarious. And if you get a version of this without an insert, you're missing something really awesome. There's also cream colored versions of the vinyl with orange Xeroxed inserts. There's a test pressing. Some of the vinyl has an orange center label. Some of the vinyl has a purple center label. So for all the vinyl nerds out there, there's a few different things you can track down for this one. The 7-inch was released on August 26th, 1993. The cover of the record is overlaid on top of NoFX's 7-inch. The PMRC can suck on this. So like Propaganda took that 7-inch cover, did like a collage on top of it, flipped it over on the back, colored out all the NoFX song information, song titles with Sharpie, and then put the back cover on.
I love how clearly not seriously the band was taking their own seeming success,
I know.
and signing to Fat Records that early on. Like,
I know.
Their immediately record didn't even come out. I mean, when you were talking about that with Steve on the Less Talk More Rock bonus episode, that's such a highlight. The humor and the willingness to just kind of poke fun of themselves and the label, you kind of got to appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. And, I know that Chris and, Fat Mike and the label kind of went their separate ways for all the reasons we talked about on the show, like ad nauseum at this point. But NoFX and Propaganda are so interconnected in those early days. And you can just tell that like Fat Mike liked that band so much.
Oh, yeah.
Because Propaganda takes the NoFX 7-inch, redoes the artwork. But then in 1996... NoFX overlays the Propaganda How to Clean Everything version with their 7-inch for the 1996 7-inch Fuck the Kids. So Propaganda takes NoFX's, and then NoFX takes Propaganda's, and it's just like this hilarious chain of events between these two bands. So another thing that's really interesting about Pigs Will Pay is that it was released as track 2 on the Martial Law with a cherry on top demo cassette tape, pre-Fat Records. So this song was around for a long time. You can find the original version in its entirety on YouTube. If you search Propaganda Martial Law, it will come up. And what's really interesting about the original version is that the lyrics are almost completely different. Okay. So, the lyrics for the one that make the How to Clean a Couple of Things 7-inch are very short. But this one has a little more lyrics. So I'm going to read them because these lyrics are really, really hard to find. And the only way you can get these lyrics essentially is if you have the martial law demo tape or a picture or a scan of the insert lyric sheet for that cassette. So here's the lyrics. Man in blue, he knocked me down, said, boy, let's have some fun. I'm going to pull my piece and then I'm going to count to one. Then, my friend, get on your feet and boy, you'd better run. Let's see if you can outrace this here bullet in my gun. Pigs will pay in a big way. I ran like hell out into the street, heard the trigger pulled, felt a bullet hit my feet. He beat me senseless and held the gun to my head. Last words as I blacked out were, Sarge, I think this one's dead. Pigs will pay. They covered up, they faked the scene and threw me in the dump. Those boys in blue had really thought they'd won. Well, don't choke on your donuts, boys, but it's only just begun. I'm still alive and I'll be back to see you bastards run. They'll pay for the guns they've used, the minorities they've abused. They'll pay for the blood they've spilled, the innocent or guilty for that matter, people they've killed.
Yeah, so different.
So different, completely different song.
And a different message, even.
Way different. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the one that makes How to Clean a Couple of Things is an overall critique of the systemic, it's a far more big picture portrayal, right?
Right.
It's about the culture of policing and how it takes people with a certain mindset about the world and essentially turns them into killing machines who do the bidding of extremely powerful people at the expense of all the people that they are paid to rule over, right? And this other version is like a first person narrative of like a teenager who has their first run with the police and has this epiphany of, oh my gosh, this is what the cops do to marginalized communities all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And now I am on the side of the marginalized communities. So the one that makes the record, I know that Chris would say that it's a far superior version because like it sounds like almost like the guy in the martial law demo version like dies and then comes back to like haunt the police to make them pay for all the things that they do to other people. So he dies and he haunts the police and like haunts them or whatever to make them pay the price for what they've done. So it almost sounds like he died and he's like coming back to like haunt them, even though you could read it both different ways. Like he doesn't die. And instead what he's going to do is he's going to like commit acts of resistance in solidarity with marginalized communities. But I think that the reason Chris may not have liked it is because like, it kind of sounds like a ghost story in a way. Like maybe he did die and he's just like going to like haunt them. So, and the liner notes of how to, of the where quantity is job number one compilation kind of talk about the ghost story theory. So I know that that's what Chris was thinking, and that's probably why he would say that the one that makes the record is a superior version. But it's a huge difference in narrative style. The original version is 3 minutes and 5 seconds long, and the one on How to Clean a Couple of Things is 2 minutes and 15 seconds. So they shaved about 50 seconds off of it. But honestly, I like both versions a whole lot.
Yeah, yeah. And what I think stands out hearing those lyrics now, Greg, from the first version is how literal they are, but how much that message changes with the version that makes the How to Clean a Couple of Things. So Pigs Will Pay Live is also track number 21 on the Where Quantity is job number one.
Mm-hmm. The lyrics for this one are the one that make the record as well, by the way.
Yeah, and the liner notes read, the original version of the song was about 6 minutes longer and was some cockamamie story about me getting shot by the police and coming back as a ghost to scare them or something.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, that's what they say.
Come on, that's impossible. I think the original version is much more palatable than Chris gives credit for.
Yeah, like, so I like the original version a whole lot. And I know that listeners do too. I was finding some YouTube comments about people who like the original one more because it makes the line pigs will pay make a little more sense, I think, if it's like this person has this mindset shift of being like, oh my gosh, this is what cops do to marginalized communities all the time. Now I'm on the other side with the marginalized people, and we're going to make them pay together as a unified front. So that's kind of like why I think that the line "Pigs Will Pay" makes a little more sense in the first version as compared to the one that makes "How to Clean a Couple of Things."
Yeah, and this song was also released as track number 12 of the How to Clean Everything 20th Anniversary Edition on August 20th, 2013. And this edition on vinyl there are 749 copies on blue and yellow swirl, 523 on translucent sea blue vinyl, and the elusive 97 on platter opaque turquoise yellow for the record store edition.
I have that. I have the record store edition.
Braggart.
Yeah, I have one. It's not opened either. It's sealed. So
you struggle with that daily.
Literally every day. And I actually just got a No Use for a Name Rarities Volume 2. It's their brand new outtakes compilation that Fat Wreck just put out, and I have a Fat Records store edition of that No Use for a Name Rarities vinyl, and it came and I opened that sucker right up, man. I didn't even hesitate. I was like, I am not gonna have another How to Clean Everything store edition on my hands, and I ripped that No Use for a Name store record right open. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. So we'll get into some other stuff here in a little bit, but something else that's kind of unique about this record compared to other Propaganda vinyl is, if anybody's ever seen this, they know that there is a giant hole in the middle of the actual vinyl, right? It's one of these super old looking, old timey 7-inches with that massive hole where you need the adapter in the middle of your turntable to actually play it. And I was like, what's the deal with this hole, man? It was making me crazy. So if you have this record, go to your shelf and pull it down right now, and you'll find that the hole is 1.5 inches in diameter, and the 7-inch was cut with the big hole in the middle. If you go to other Propaganda 7-inches, it's the tiny hole that's the size of the spindle in the middle of any standard turntable. So why does this big hole for 7 inches exist? Why? And the answer, Keith, is capitalism. Friends out there, the answer is capitalism. I found a blog.
Isn't it always?
I found a blog called A Journal of Musical Things, which answers this question, and I will read a passage from the entry on the hole sizes of 45 RPM 7-inch records. And the following passage is a direct quote and a history of the 1.5 inch diameter hole in the middle of 45s. For the first 50 years of the turntable's existence, the spindle on which you placed the record was a standard size, approximately 0.283 inches. That was also the size of the hole drilled into all records. When Columbia Records introduced a 33 1/3 RPM long playing album in 1948, they kept the hole in the center the same size. However, Columbia's arch rival, RCA, was most annoyed at this new format. Rather than license Columbia's technology for their releases, RCA introduced their own new record, the 7-inch single that spun at 45 RPM and had a center hole that measured 1.5 inches in diameter. Why would they do something like that? 2 reasons. While the LP promised up to 22 minutes of uninterrupted music per side, RCA's crowed that their 45s could be stacked on the special tall, fat spindle about 6 inches high. That was exclusive to RCA manufactured turntables. Once a side of a 45 finished playing after 5 or 6 minutes, the tone arm moved away long enough for the next record to drop down onto the platter. The tone arm then swung back into place and the music would continue. With the ability to stack up 10 45s on the RCA spindle, it was theoretically possible for the music to continue for a full hour without human intervention. So this is like old school disc changer, dude. RCA wanted their new format to crush Columbia's LPs, so they began selling turntables that they could play 45s. The thinking was that once someone bought one of these turntables with the fat spindles, they were theoretically locked into buying music in that format from then on. It was just like the future VHS, beta, and Blu-ray HD video wars. But there was a more scientific reason for the larger hole. When a new 45 dropped from the spindle onto the turntable, it was required to spin up from a dead stop to 45 RPM very quickly. This torque tended to cause the small holes to go out of round very quickly, causing records to wobble as it spun. The larger hole allowed the sudden rotational force to be distributed over a longer path, about 4.712 inches, reducing wear and allowing the hole to stay round longer. So that is the history behind the big hole in the middle of 45 RPM 7-inch records. It's a capitalism war between two competing music companies back in the day.
I always just assumed the technology itself had changed and adapted. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of nerdiness for record people that I found out there, which is kind of a standalone thing for Propaganda, because this is the one record that I have by Propaganda with the big hole. And Keith, do you have a copy of this 7-inch, don't you?
I do.
Nice. Were you able to look at it all at the insert today? I had a good time with this one.
I didn't take a look at that today, no.
So the insert to this 7-inch has some real gems in it. The 7-inch came out a few months after How to Clean Everything, and they didn't enjoy the art on the first record. And the caption on the inside of this record says, quote, "Cover by us, unlike our crappy LP cover, which was done by Dan Totally Shitty Drawer Sites, who should apply at Hanna-Barbera or something because he sucks." And so like they did the cover title in whiteout. Like the title of the record is like written in whiteout on this record, and they're ripping on the cover art for the LP. And another little tidbit of this 7-inch disc says that on the cover is my big buddy Brad. He is barfing. He doesn't mind. He also shit in my microwave. I'm okay about that kind of thing. And these are the kinds of tidbits that are inside this insert, right? And the last detail that I want to discuss is the back cover of this 7-inch. There's a little story which says Mr. Maley at the top on the back cover. And it's like a little story written by John K. Samson right in the middle of the back cover. And it says, it's a story about John and Mr. Maley, his shop teacher. And the passage reads, "You aren't very smart," he said, "and you aren't very serious about what's important. When are you going to grow up?" he said. "But I decided right there that the conventional sense of maturity is a facade, and people should stop wasting their time on convention and spend it on life. So I laughed. It made him twice as angry as he was before. I enjoyed it very much." So this is a story about John K. Samson wrote about his shop teacher from his high school who was, talking down to him essentially. And then John didn't find what this person was saying to be very interesting. So he laughed in response. And then the teacher got even angrier, which is a feeling you and I probably both know very, very well.
Oh, students absolutely know what to do to push your buttons. And you can't really blame them in that case. And
you look ridiculous. You're out of control.
The blame is 100% on the adult in the classroom there.
Obviously. So check this out, dude. You're going to love this. So I heard from a listener in Winnipeg who told me about this back cover, right? Somebody in Winnipeg, I'm not going to say who, wrote to me and they said, "I went to the same high school as John K. Samson did, and Mr. Maley is a real teacher, and that's his real name." So check this out. John K. Samson went to Kelvin High School, and everything in Winnipeg is connected. And he said that this listener who wrote in said that Maley was there when he was a student also. And if you go to the website kelvinhistory.org, you can find all 700 plus former staff members of Kelvin High School, including a headshot of one Mr. K. Maley, shop teacher, who taught there from 1980 to 1999. And there's a picture of him and everything. It's a real dude, legit reference on the back cover of a 7-inch that sold thousands of copies all over the world. And it's a real guy, and you can find his headshot at Kelvin History. I found it. I looked at it today.
I'm kind of thinking now what that would look like if me at my worst as an educator would pop up in my students' art.
Oh my God.
That would then change the lives and minds of countless people across the globe. That's amazing.
We really should think about this. Like if one of our students wrote a dig at us and put it on the back of an album cover someday, like what would that student have written about us?
Oh boy.
I'm gonna have to think about that. That's a nice that's a nice little creative writing exercise. So anyway, so that is a bit about the cover art. So that's all I got.
Yeah, Greg, who's the guest for this episode? Let's get to that.
So our guest is someone who I'm very excited to talk to. It's Dr. Irina Ceric. Irina Ceric is a professor of criminology and legal studies at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Dr. Ceric's research interests focus on the intersections of law and social movements, state repression, and law and organizing. Dr. Ceric's teaching and course design reflects the centrality of Indigenous law and history to the Canadian legal framework. And she is conveniently a massive Propaganda fan. Propaganda fans are smart, amazing people. Like I am continually impressed by the folks who love this band. So in this conversation, we talked about activism, the police, the song Pigs Will Pay, and much more. Irina Ceric, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm so delighted to have you here. Did we come together for a conversation because of a friendship with Lauren Corman, who was on a previous episode? Is that how we came to be communicating?
I don't think so. I mean, I am friends with Lauren, and I think she's the bee's knees. No, I had tweeted sort of a jokey tweet about how, and we thought nation states were a bad idea, could replace a lot of the teaching that I do.
Oh, that's right. So you've probably picked up on the fact now that, like, if you follow me on Twitter, every time the word propaganda is dropped on Twitter, I like those tweets almost universally, unless I feel like they're like the tweet is like twisting the meaning of what propaganda originally like is trying to say within their song. So sometimes I don't, but I'm glad that I found you that way. It's nice to find fellow propaganda fans and in the greater Toronto area nonetheless. So I'm like down the street from you, which is really fantastic. I love it.
I know, I'm just waving at you from across the lake, hoping that border reopens at some point.
I know. And then we'll go to shows and we'll have a good time. But for the meantime, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. And I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment, Irina, and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit so they know who you are and what you do.
Thanks. So hi, everybody. My name is Irina Ceric. And yes, I am currently coming at you from Toronto, Dish with One Spoon, Treaty Territory. I am a lawyer by training, although I don't practice law anymore. I teach full time. I teach in the criminology department at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, just outside of Vancouver. And I am also a long-time activist and legal support organizer. And a lot of my activist and academic work and thinking is at that intersection of law and social movements.
Fabulous. Okay, well, that is really important for context for the conversation that we're going to have here today about the song that we're going to chat about in a little bit. But I want to know a little bit more about your work and what inspires you to do what you do, to pursue the life that you have. Your website talks a little bit about your background in grassroots activism, law and organizing, and public interest lawyering, which I found was a really fascinating term in and of itself, public interest lawyering. It just stands out to me. And I'm curious if you can tell me about some major turning points in your life where you realize the need to engage in work that makes society better. How did you get interested in activism work in the first place?
That's a really good question. And I would sort of go right back to my family history. I was born in, what is now Serbia, what was then Yugoslavia, and all of my grandparents had been, anti-fascists,
Mm.
had been involved in one degree or another, in the revolution that made socialist Yugoslavia possible. And so I think their very early influence, sort of set me up on a certain trajectory. We moved to Canada when I was 6.
Yeah.
So I grew up in Canada. And when I think in terms of the events in my own life and in my own time, that sort of led me towards becoming an activist. It sort of builds on that kind of family history. So I'm thinking here of, the first Gulf War,
Mm.
the Oka crisis,
Hmm.
sort of the sort of rise of environmental movements, or I guess the re-rise of environmental movements in the 90s. All of these things, I think, kind of set me off on figuring out how to get engaged. But it wasn't really until I was in university that I think I figured out how to actually become an activist, in the sense of finding other people to work with. And so it was when I was about 17 or 18 that I first started doing environmental activism and Indigenous solidarity work. And sort of, becoming involved in various organizations and movements in Toronto.
What got you interested in Indigenous solidarity movements in the first place? I'm curious about that one particularly.
I mean, honestly, I think it was Oka
Oh, okay.
at first. I mean, I was pretty young when that happened. I was 14 that summer, but um, I think it left a huge impact on me. And then a couple of years later, after that, I had this sort of strange summer job where you could work for the Ontario government in a provincial park as a junior ranger.
Mm.
And I was sent way up in northwestern Ontario that summer, and ended up spending some time on various reserves, including some pretty remote ones. And that was a shocking thing for me to see at that
Mm.
at that age. One of the reserves that we were on sort of became infamous a little while later um, youth suicides. Even spending a small amount of time there, the sort of oppression and repression that community had been living under for generations was just really palpable. And it really sort of shifted my understanding of Canada, and the sort of the myths around Canada as this sort of beacon of human rights and equality, and puppies and rainbows and all that.
Mm. So, what were the conversations like in your household growing up, having family from the former Yugoslavia, like surrounding you? Like, were those conversations just like all around you your entire life that were sort of just sinking in all along the way?
Mm, I don't know if they were continuous, especially because my grandparents, stayed behind
Uh-huh.
after me and my parents moved here. Um, but certainly one of my grandmothers, who did end up moving to Canada during the Yugoslav wars of the 90s. I think she was sort of a constant kind of um, I'm trying to think what the right word is. Influence is maybe a little bit too strong, but she's certainly always kind of served as sort of this like quiet source of sort of making the right decisions, in terms of what to pursue in my life, and shaping values and making decisions.
Interesting. Okay, now I'm curious. So, like, we have this like family. We have some personal stories here to kind of like show this path that you've pursued. And I'm curious where music comes into play as part of your interests. I'm curious if music was before your interests in like public interest lawyering and activism, or if music came after. Like, what was that like?
Oh, I think it kind of came around at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The same time that I was sort of becoming aware of, these sort of, these environmental and social justice issues, towards the end of high school and the beginning of university. I think I was also discovering, the sort of world of alternative music.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I was trying to think about this the other day, in preparation for this conversation, and I think that I actually have Sassy Magazine to thank for, like,
Ooh.
introducing me to Riot Girl. And I think that was like the first time I ever like sent away for a zine or sent away for a record. Like at that point I had been like listening to a lot of classic rock and a lot of hair metal.
Yeah.
And so I was ready for heavier music. And I think that was definitely my gateway into punk and hardcore, and then eventually to propaganda.
Yeah. Well, finding smart bands was like a really important thing for me to experience. Like I remember hearing like Bad Religion, Propaganda the first time and being like blown away at the fact of how smart it was. What were some of your like first like smart bands, quote unquote smart bands that you really latched onto intellectually?
Yeah, I love that framing, because that's exactly what it was. It was like, stuff that sort of moved me in the same way, that like Led Zeppelin or Guns N' Roses might, but
Yeah.
but that was smart. I would definitely say, Bikini Kill at first, and other Riot Girl bands, Heavens to Betsy. But then I don't exactly remember the timeline at this point, but Fugazi after that. I mean, I think Fugazi, and maybe I shouldn't say this on a propaganda podcast, but
No, it's fine.
Fugazi remains my favorite band of all time. And they had a huge impact on me. And I vividly remember listening to one of their albums, for the first time, and like really sitting down with it and reading the lyrics, and my mind just being fucking blown. That sound and the lyrics, and and I didn't really understand DIY culture at that point, but that was just they completely changed the direction of my life.
Yeah, we have nothing but love for Fugazi here, and there's also the Fugazi, the alphabetical Fugazi, Fuga A to Fuga Z, which is a podcast where they do a song by song breakdown of Fugazi's music, which is another podcast that I completely love. So if anybody out there is looking for a song by song Fugazi podcast, it exists, and you should go find it because it rules. Well, Irina, how did you find Propaganda specifically? Tell me about this origin story that you have.
So I did first hear How to Clean Everything. I'm around the right age that I got into them immediately. That record came out just before I started university, and so I don't remember exactly when I got my hands on it, but that those years, 1993, 1994, I was living in a collective house, with like other punks.
So cool.
And How to Clean Everything was, it was just on all the time. And it was funny because I think that at first I remember being a little skeptical of it, because I didn't consider myself being into pop punk.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't listen to other Fat Records bands, and I think that there was a little bit of snobbishness on our parts, but or at least on my part. I shouldn't speak for my housemates. But then I actually listened to it and just loved it immediately. Loved the lyrics. I do enjoy, a good hook as much as anyone else, and they've certainly got that. And so we were obsessed with that record. I think just sort of probably overplayed it. And then just sort of, just kept going from there. I mean, and this is where I'm going to disagree, with you with this podcast. But for me, the early records are my favorite records. Let's Talk More Rock. Let's Talk More Rock is definitely my favorite Propaganda album. And it was, I felt like we waited forever for it, even though in hindsight it was only 3 years. But
yeah,
that was such a powerful record, in terms of tying together the politics and the music, and it just was for me was also just so important, because I was at that point really heavily involved in the Toronto like DIY hardcore scene, going to a lot of shows, putting on shows. A friend of mine and I put on shows in small venues, but also in our basement. And I felt like there was a lot of sort of lip service to politics and activism that just was never really fulfilled in hardcore. And Propaganda to me stood out as a band that was just much more articulate about what what was actually possible in terms of politics, both in their analysis and their lyrics, and just kind of walking the walk in the sense of having tables from organizations at their shows and stuff like that.
So you've been fans of Propaganda for a long time at this point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I want to know some stories about seeing them live. Like if you were able to see them live in the early days, like if you've remained a fan of them the entire time, like tell me about some like stories of like going to see this band that really stand out in your life.
Oh, definitely, a fan for life at this point. So I had to like text. I have a terrible memory. I had to like text people over the last few days, being like,
Nice.
"You remember the first time we saw Propaganda?"
Yeah.
And it turned. The answer came back from one of my ex partners, who reminded me that the first time I saw them was in 1996 in Toronto, and it was actually it's because they played a benefit for Friends of the Lubicon Cree Nation. In northern Alberta, who at the time was wrapped up in this lawsuit with a Japanese paper company that was Friends of Lubicon, not the Lubicon First Nation. Friends of Lubicon, which was an activist group working in support of the Lubicon Nation, had been sued by a Japanese paper company. Basically, it was a lawsuit to try and get them to stop doing activism, to stop doing advocacy. They had been organizing a boycott of the products of this logging company. And Propaganda played a benefit for Friends of the Lubicon in 1996 at the El Macombo in Toronto, and that was the very first time I saw them. And I just remember being, once I was sort of reminded of that moment, I just remember that being so important, not only to finally see them, after a number of years of listening to them, but to see them, play a benefit, for an organization, that my partner was really involved in, that was, just doing really amazing work. And so to me, it just sort of felt like a good sort of, coalescing of everything that made Propaganda important to me.
Was that with John K. Samson on bass? Was he on that show?
I do not remember that.
Okay, that's
unfortunately.
totally.
I mean, I'm sure that could be researched because the show was in December of '96. So
okay, cool. Have you seen them? Have you like continued to go see them throughout the the last couple of decades?
Oh yeah. I think the most recent time I saw them was actually not that long ago, in DC with Iron Sheik. So I've seen them a lot. I mean, I think the other show that really stands out for me was at the Opera House, also in Toronto.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, it's a great venue. One of my favorite
love
venues. Yeah, for sure. I think in like the early aughts, and I remember that one because a friend of mine who works with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, OCAP, had been invited to, I guess, like say, talk a little bit about OCAP, during Propaganda's set. And she got super heckled. I mean, I think there's always sort of been that, that kind of disconnect between some of Propaganda's audience and, and them and their politics. But I think they picked on the wrong girl. I mean, she was just not having it. And, I'm kind of amazed that she didn't like jump in and start throwing punches. And that was just a great moment of just like watching this, this fierce, badass woman activist just sort of, do what, I've had to do at shows too over the years, right? Of just not take that shit from dudes in the audience.
Yeah. As as the great saying goes, not just boys fun, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In theory. And I think that that's something that the whole scene is still working towards, obviously with each passing year. So, as a professor and a lawyer now, I'm curious a little more about like some of your specific areas of interest in relation to the song that we're going to get into, Pigs Will Pay. And, I was digging in a little bit more to your faculty website, and it says that you are really into critical legal studies, law and organizing, social movements in North America and the Balkans. And then there's this term TWAIL. Can you explain what that means really quick?
Sure. So it's a TWAIL.
Yeah.
That's how it's pronounced, and it stands for Third World Approaches to International Law. So this is very, very inside baseball, kind of like nerdy international law. But it's a group of scholars and a way of approaching international law that sort of foregrounds histories of colonialism, and resistance to colonialism as as sites of international law, whereas mainstream international law sort of really tends to kind of take kind of great powers for granted, and TWAIL is an attempt to rewrite some of that history.
Wonderful. Okay. And then you're also interested in political economy and law and critical approaches to human rights. And I find all of these things to be sort of circling around the drain, if you will, of Pigs Will Pay. And it just really stands out to me about how many ways that your career seems to be related to this extremely concise song with very few lyrics. And, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about why you chose this song, maybe how you feel personally connected to it, and, just anything that jumps out about like why you landed on this one during our emails back and forth the last couple weeks.
Sure. Well, I'll start by noting that this is one of the very few 7 inches I've ever owned.
Yeah.
Was How to Clean a Couple of Things. I think for somebody who's as into music as I am and has been for as long as I am, I actually have a very small sort of physical collection.
Hmm.
But I do own a couple of some Propaganda vinyl, and this is one of them. And I was always really into this song. And when How to Clean Everything was re-released, I guess more than once now. I was really happy to see this song, appended, because I've always really liked it, and I thought it kind of needed to be on a full length.
Yeah.
Um, and I just really like it. I think if I was listening to Lauren Corman's episode, the one on nailing Descartes to the wall, and she said something that really jumped out at me. She said that she kind of thought that Propaganda was doing critical animal studies before critical animal studies was a thing, and I think Pigs Will Pay is also a really strong critique of policing and criminal justice, that's sort of a little bit ahead of its time. I mean, obviously there's a very long tradition, in not just in punk, but in rock and country, in hip hop, in reggae, of songs that are critical of police.
Hmm.
But I think this one has actually a really strong analysis, kind of buried in there. And then it also has, just that really kind of awesome, slightly goofy sing along, point your fingers chorus too.
Yeah.
Um, so I really love this song, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yeah, and we were chatting about this song back and forth, and we were thinking about doing "Fuck the Border," and we were thinking about doing "Pigs Will Pay." Was it hard for you to select this song from the list that I sent, or was this like bam right away?
Oh, it was kind of bam. Yeah,
I
for
love
sure.
it. I love it. Well, and I love the fact that earlier you mentioned very proudly, very openly that the first couple of records for Propaganda really are your favorites. Like we have no bias here towards what era of the band people like the most. We probably should have phrased that a little differently on our first episode, but it is what it is, and it creates a little bit of fun, jovial back and forth with the audience, which we dig. But like, so Pigs Will Pay, you mentioned that this is before its time, essentially. It's ahead of its time, if you will. These incidents with police like beating people mercilessly, sometimes to their death, is something that has gone on in like around the world for so long now. But the prevalence of smartphones in so many pockets today, it feels like at any given moment, it's broadcastable instantly. Any person can turn into an exposing journalist, a journalist exposing abuse in real time, live streaming all over the internet. And it seems like the amount of times that law enforcement gets caught on tape doing heinous things to human bodies is really stunning. And so I'm just curious, like how you see this song connecting to the current time and place that we're in, where we can actually see so many more of these things. Everybody can see it now. Before, when I was growing up, like sequestered in the suburbs, like I would never see these kinds of things, and now I can see it anytime by just paying like a little bit of attention. So, how do you see this song as being relevant to the here and now where we live today in 2021?
Can I start by going back to how it was relevant in 1993?
Yes, please do. So that's actually like, go ahead and do that, and then kind of weave us up until now.
Yeah. So the reason I actually want to start with when this song came out, is because, and I'm gonna take a wild guess here, at some of the thinking behind the lyrics,
Hmm.
and I don't know if Chris Hanna or anyone else from the band has ever talked about it, but what I find really interesting is that this song kind of charts, I think, what sort of the process that a lot of us go through of at first having this sort of kind of knee-jerk, maybe slightly immature sort of, fuck the pigs kind of attitude, that then, grows into a more, mature, systemic, informed critique of policing, and the sort of broader issues around race, criminal justice, everything else. That's how I've always read it anyway. That the second sentence of the song is the battle hymn, the mantra of a once unfocused mind, but as logic tempered anger, still inspired but now informed, the pigs we turned to caricature became far worse than we'd warned. And part of me wonders, back in 1993, 94, when this song came out, I feel like what was still really fresh in the minds of a lot of people was the Rodney King beating, which is one of the sort of, I think, first instances of police brutality that is captured in real time on video and then becomes immediately publicized. And so I don't know if there's any actual connection there. But to me, the timing of that song back then speaks to what was then becoming sort of the beginning of where we are now, which, as you said, in which is a world in which cell phones and other technology can capture instances of police brutality, police misconduct, much faster. It can go viral immediately. We of course also have the fact that a lot of cops now wear body cameras and are themselves recording, their interactions with police, or should be recording. That's a whole other kettle of fish. And so I find it interesting to think about how this song was already very relevant in 1993. Was, I think, speaking to something that has only sort of become more ingrained since then. And so when I think about where we're at right now in both Canada and the US, where there is, for the first time in my lifetime, actual discussions happening around defunding police, around even abolishing police. To me, the roots of that resistance, obviously go back decades, particularly to the work of, Black organizers and Black feminists, but also Indigenous activists and Indigenous communities. And, from my perspective as, sort of a white, my white countercultural perspective, pigs will pay makes as much sense in 2021 as it did in 1993, in a slightly sort of different way, but in an equally kind of nuanced way.
And a line really jumps out at me too, because I remember the Rodney King being broadcast, the Rodney King beatings being broadcast all over television, and then you hear all these things that come out in the aftermath of that, like, oh, it's like these small amount of bad apples, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like apologism and defense that comes into it, and there's a line in the song. It's not just isolated incidents of cop jocks kicking ass. It's a fucking war machine protecting the wealth of the employing class. And it really jumps out at me as well in relation to your work. And I actually found an article that you wrote called Organizing for Accountability in the Journal of Law and Social Policy. And like, the opening passage of your article, I mean, I'm going to read a little tiny piece of it here, but it really jumps out. You wrote, the police, almost by definition, wield enormous power, possessing legally sanctioned rights to stop, search, arrest, charge, use force, and kill. Even in the best of circumstances, the result is an inherent power imbalance between the police and their civilian subjects. This imbalance is far greater in the communities of the poor and the marginalized. Any discussion of police complaints processes and their significance must be located within this context, one that recognizes that police accountability goes to the heart of the most intimate of citizen-state relationships, affecting not only the criminal justice system, but broader issues of poverty, racism, homelessness, and informal economies, and in turn, the social movements that address those issues. Police complaint mechanisms are integral to a functioning police force, supplying bargaining power to the subject-police relationship and serving as a primary tenet of overall accountability. And this passage that you put into the beginning of this article feels like an academic version of what Chris is saying. And I felt like you were almost like channeling the energy of this song into, an academic argument. you know, I'm assuming that like this song has been really inspirational to you over the years, but you know, the notion of it's not just isolated incidents in that song connects directly to what you said about the enormous power. And I'm curious if you can comment on the connection between that line and possibly this article that you wrote a while back.
For sure, for sure. And like I said, I mean, I think that line also speaks to, this tracing of the development of, of a political consciousness, right? Of being able to sort of translate, maybe the cop jocks that, a lot of young punks come into contact with, at shows or skateboarding or whatever. And then, taking those personal experiences and realizing that they are part of a much bigger set of problems, right?
Yeah.
In which your problems are actually kind of the not necessarily so big.
Yeah.
So I love that. I love that part of the song. And so as much as it I think speaks so well as a punk song, to young punks and can then sort of grow with them. I think it also, as you said, I mean, it speaks to so many analyses of policing culture, um, and of policing as an institution. This idea that, as you said, that it's not just a couple of bad apples, and this is something that I think about a lot because I teach in a criminology department, and so many of my students want to be police officers
Mm-hmm.
or border guards. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not, and I've said this in classrooms. I don't mind saying it publicly. I feel like part of my job is to talk them out of that.
Mm.
I don't want to see, young people who want to, make the world a better place become cops. And I think part of the way that I talk about that, in my work and in the classroom is to think about the institution, right? And to sort of depersonalize it. And so to not just think that's sort of the flip side, right? And what we can say that the problem with policing isn't just a couple of bad apples, that it's not just that there are some cops that are that are violent or that persist, that are racist or misogynist or whatever. That if we look historically at the function of police in capitalist societies, that's the way that's actually the window that we need. And that's, I think, a better way to approach a young person who wants to be a cop, because it allows you to say, yeah, you're a good person. You have good intentions. You are not going to change this system.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to change you. Um, and and so to me, that line of, it's not just isolated incidents of cop jocks kicking ass, is so important in so many ways. And if I think back to that article that you wrote, it also speaks to really sort of the failure of a lot of oversight and accountability mechanisms, because again, trying to fix policing through addressing particular incidents after they have already happened, it just isn't going to work.
Mm.
Again, you can discipline a few officers here and there. We know how rarely that happens. There's so much research out there in terms of, what happens to police who are either charged criminally or who go through some sort of an internal disciplinary process, that it's really, really hard, to sort of address police brutality or police misconduct that way.
So a question that I have is like we're in the midst of, the trial surrounding the murder of George Floyd right now. And it's very publicized here in the United States. And I'd imagine that you're seeing I imagine you're seeing stories of it as well, as somebody who pays attention to these things. And I'm curious if you see a trend like going in the direction of more prosecutions, more accountability, or if this is like a delusion that we're living in because we are publicizing a few big ones while letting tons and tons and tons of little ones get off scot-free. Are we moving in the right direction, or is it an illusion?
I think we are moving in the right direction. But not far enough, and I don't think it's a delusion. I mean, I think this is one version of a question that that so many social movements ask in so many ways, right? What is the benefit of short-term reform that leaves broader systems untouched?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those questions, sorry, the answers to those questions always have to be really nuanced, right? In the sense of thinking about who gains from short-term reforms, and what can those short-term reforms you know maybe push forward more effectively in the future. So I think if we look at demand for prosecuting police officers, so for example the officers who killed George Floyd or who shot Breonna Taylor, I think that those demands are coming out of impacted communities, and to me that is a legitimate ask. And I also feel like those communities are sophisticated enough to understand that that's not going to change the system, but it is still important as a short term goal, in part because it addresses those particular harms, but I think it also provides an opportunity for public education. It provides opportunities for people to get involved in campaigns. And so so many movements have to deal with that question of how do you use these kinds of incidents, these kinds of moments for mobilizing, even when you know that the benefits that are going to come out are going to be partial.
I find myself right now in a state of great admiration for what you just told me about your own teaching, where you're in a department with a lot of people who want to become a part of this system, that they don't really realize the full extent to which their behavior might change in the future. And you're really asking them to question, who are you? What do you want to be? Like, I find that to be so amazing. Like, have you ever had any pushback on that from, in your career, from colleagues, from students, anything like that, about the way that you really ask them to critique their own trajectory in life like that?
I mean, I think that's a difficult question to answer, because I think criminology as a discipline, I think, is having sort of a moment of reckoning, both in Canada and the U.S. And some, the Black Lives Matter movement, and calls for defunding or abolishing police and prisons, have, I think, really pushed criminologists to ask themselves the kinds of questions that you're asking. And those questions have come up in my department, and they haven't come up necessarily in ways that are positive. They've been divisive to a large degree. And I think it's not uncommon in the academy and in other areas, to find people who work together, but who have very different perspectives on some foundational questions. And so, I know that I have, colleagues and students who share my views, but I also know that I don't. But I think one of the great things about being teaching social science is that you get to point to sort of to evidence and to think through big ideas with the time and care and historical context that they deserve. And that's something that I actually think I could do a lot better. I think that the moment that we're in should be an opportunity to sort of go further in the sense of really trying to think through what is the historical origin of police and prisons? What can replace them? And, I think we're really lucky that there's so many amazing thinkers really looking at those questions in really fundamental ways. And so I think, part of the job of educators right now is to bring those voices into classrooms.
I love it. Well, I know that, in our private correspondence, you were also mentioning a lot more of your recent work involving policing of indigenous movements and how it might resonate with this song as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about that too?
Yeah, sure. So I'm thinking here about the line that follows the one that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
It's a fucking war machine protecting the wealth of the employing class.
Yeah.
And I love that line. I mean, I love all the lines in the song, but I think that one really kind of combines, two sort of really big ideas, about the origin and the historical function of police. One, that police often are seen as occupying armies of racialized and poor communities. That's not my language. That is in the language of communities themselves. And I think fucking war machine can also point to the increasing link between, or I guess the increasing militarization of police, that over the last 2 decades or so, police forces throughout Canada and the US have become far more militarized in the way that they are organized and deployed, but also in terms of how they're equipped. And particularly in the US, there's a sort of very direct pipeline between the military and the police in terms of equipping them, particularly for so-called public order policing. So the policing of, of demonstrations, protests, and other instances of so-called disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a third, there's sort of a third way that I understand this line, and that's looking at the second half, which is about protecting the wealth of the employing class.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're going to have a critique or an understanding of how police operate in, advanced liberal democracies, you have to look at capitalism, and you have to look at the role that police have played, in protecting capital. And I think one of the most straightforward illustrations of that right now is in the policing of Indigenous movements in Canada. One of the things I've been really spending a lot of time research and thinking about over the last couple of years is the issue of injunctions, which are court orders that are often sought by resource extraction companies. So like pipeline companies or mines or logging companies, who seek a court order to prevent people from, protesting that project, or, blockading access to that project, or, whatever form of resistance is being undertaken to that project. And so we've seen over the last few years a number of really sort of, big events that have at their root injunctions. So this time last year in February of 2020, there was a major sort of RCMP deployment on the territory of the Wet'suwet'en in northern so-called British Columbia, where several blockades had been set up to challenge the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And police ended up enforcing that court order that pipeline company had gotten, and arresting a number of land defenders and some allies. That precipitated a whole host of solidarity actions across Canada, protests, rail blockades, road blockades. It then also precipitated a whole other wave of injunctions as, governments and rail companies tried to criminalize this form of solidarity. And so to me, injunctions are a really, really clear example of how police, through court orders, are specifically deployed to protect the wealth of the employing class. A corporation goes to court, the court gives them an order that says, yes, get these people off this land, even if it's their land, even if it's their territory, and the police do it. I mean, it's an incredible sort of public-private repression process.
Oh man, the criminalization of dissent that I'm hearing from you right now, it's just so overwhelming. And we did the Purina Hall of Fame episode recently, and in the aftermath of that, a bunch of folks over in Ontario who listen to the show sent me tons of articles about the criminalization of going to slaughterhouses, industrial slaughterhouses, and like trespassing on those, and like the penalties were like expanded exponentially like within the last year. So like this is something that is still ongoing. And so if we think about the criminalization of dissent as a broad problem, what would you suggest that activist oriented people know in the face of the increasing criminalization of dissent? What are some things that you feel like people who care about activism should know?
I love that question. They should know two things. One, they should know the terrain, and so I think you're right that terrain is actually shifting right now. Injunctions have been around for a long time, but there really has been an uptick in the number of injunctions that are issued, and how wide the activities that they criminalize are. You mentioned that there has been an uptick in so-called agriculture. Legislation that aims to criminalize, animal rights activism. Alberta just passed legislation that, is arguably unconstitutional, but that, criminalizes certain kinds of protests in relation to, to railroads and other infrastructure. So, there is a very sort of pernicious increase in criminalization, and so people need to know the terrain. But I think, and this is the second, and I think more important thing that people need to know, is that terrain does not mean that you need to not be active, and that terrain is not insurmountable. I think really what people need to learn or relearn, because I think this is something that movements have been doing for a long time, but we don't tend to pass knowledge on very well, is how to defend ourselves and how to organize legal support. That's something that I've been involved with for going on a couple of decades now, and I think is really key here. There are forces arraigned against us, but we can also work to defend ourselves and defend our communities and defend our movements. And there are people who have these skills, and they're more than happy to pass them on. There's a lot that's been written over the years by and for activists about how to train people about the law, how to organize legal support projects, how to support people in the face of mass arrests. That information and those skills is out there. And there are some groups doing really good work. So for example, in Toronto, the Movement Defense Committee is a really great resource for movements who fear that they might be criminalized. So yeah, like know thy enemy, but also don't think that enemy is unbeatable. I think that having experiences of repression or criminalization can actually be really generative, in the sense that I think it can really sort of shape people's political analysis and allow them to sort of build strength and even grow movements in the face of repression.
You mentioned being able to pass those lessons on. Is that why you became a lawyer, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I feel like you've asked a couple of questions about being a lawyer, and I haven't answered any of them directly. I'm now realizing.
Okay.
Well, I became a lawyer very, very young. And I don't think I had a really good sense of what it is that lawyers do day to day, but I certainly had this sort of vague idea that I had been arrested at a protest. Most of my friends had been at that point, and that I wanted to defend people and maybe save the earth in some, very, very mushy way. And I don't think I've done the second one very well, but I have been involved in movement defense for a long time, and I think that there is a need always for lawyers who are willing to work with movements, particularly lawyers who are willing to work with activists and organizations in ways that are sort of more collective and that are more political than what a lot of lawyers do with ordinary clients. But I think that where I've also landed much more in the last decade or so is that I think it's just really important to train non-lawyer activists in the law. And that non-lawyer activists can often pass on information about the actual operation of the criminal justice system and organize legal support in ways that lawyers aren't interested in doing or don't have time to do. And so I think that building those skills within movements is actually super important.
You mentioned an organization just a few minutes ago, and I'm wondering if there's any other organizations you would like to promote. Like, it can be anything related to law enforcement accountability movements. It could be related to activist defense organizations. Are there any other groups that you would like to plug or promote that listeners check out if they're looking to learn more?
So I did mention the Movement Defense Committee in Toronto, and I think that they do really, really, really great movement defense work. Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project as well is really important. I until very recently I was based in Vancouver, and I think there's some groups there doing really awesome work on this front, like Pivot, for example. People might want to look them up. I think in the US, for US listeners who are interested in these topics, I would definitely say check out the Civil Liberties Defense Center in Oregon. They do amazing work around defending movements, as does the National Lawyers Guild. Both Ontario and BC have law unions, which are organizations of progressive lawyers and law students. So another amazing resource there as well.
Nice. Well, Irina, I have been so just thrilled with this conversation. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Not just Pigs Will Pay, but your work and the way it connects to what this song is saying is so wonderful. And I'm really glad that you made those connections in order to choose this song, because honestly, I can't imagine having a better conversation about this song than the one we've just had. And I'm wondering if you can tell people where they can find you if they want to follow some of your work, maybe read some things, or anything else that you would like to say, like where people can find you if they want to get in touch.
Sure. Well, I am pretty active on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is just at Irina Ceric. So at IRINACERIC. I also have a new Instagram account called Law and Protest, so at Law and Protest, where I'm also posting this kind of work. And I think my Twitter leads to my academia page, where you can get access to a number of things that I have written.
That is exactly where I read your article earlier, so I can confirm that does work. Well,
Perfect.
Irina Ceric, I'm just so thrilled having you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on to chat about activism, policing, pigs will pay, being a lawyer, and so much more. It's just been a real pleasure.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's not just isolated incidents of cop trucks kicking ass. It's a fucking war machine protecting the wealth of the employing class.
So that was my chat with Dr. Irina Ceric from Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And thank you so much for that fantastic conversation. So Keith, what do you want to start with tonight?
How about the music, Greg?
That sounds great. So let's get into some guitars here. First of all, I love this song, Keith. I don't know if you have a long, storied, attentive history with this song or not.
I don't know. I feel really embarrassed co-hosting a podcast about propaganda. And before we started this, I never even heard of it.
Yeah,
Be
dude.
honest. I'm sorry, everybody.
No, that's fine. This podcast is about going on a musical journey with a buddy. And so I love it. But this song is so good to me. I absolutely love this song. I like this song more than half of How to Clean Everything. Like if this was on How to Clean Everything, it would be easily in my top 6 favorite songs that entire LP. Like there are so many songs on How to Clean Everything that I would have removed for this song. Mm-hmm. Hands down. Like the decision making for how records get made and sequencing and everything like that, I think a lot of it is a little bit of hindsight is 2020, especially when you think about the strength of a song like this, which doesn't go on a record, where there are easily 4 songs that are inferior to this song, like no questions asked. But for this one, for the guitar, the thing that really stands out to me is this is like stuff that so many bands would go on to rip off in the coming years.
Right.
That little guitar lick, that that's like Cheshire Cat and Dude Ranch, like before Blink-182 was doing that stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those little guitar licks in the middle of the song, like I guarantee you inspired the heck out of a ton of bands. Like I know Tom DeLonge from Blink-182 was a propaganda fan back in the day. And I feel like this is the kind of song that he would like sink his teeth into as a teenager, which would help him come up with like the opening lick to the song, like Eminem's off Cheshire Cat. It's the most inspirational type of guitar playing that resonates throughout the rest of the 90s when it comes to skate punk like this. Mm-hmm. And, Chris was just doing this stuff before so many of these other people. Like there isn't a guitar lick like that on like Bad Religion records. And Bad Religion is the band that was like most inspiring those other Southern California bands, No Effects. And those bands don't do licks like that. Like that's Chris. And then it starts showing up a couple years later on Cheshire Cat, and then a couple years later on Dude Ranch and stuff like that. And to me, this is one of the origins of that little middle guitar lick.
Yeah, Greg, I think that really makes a lot of sense what you said, because I hear this on How to Clean Everything. Like it would fit so well on it, but it also just stands out, like you said, because I like it so much more than most of the songs on that album. And I really like the intro riff, how it builds in speed. It starts off kind of simple, then it gets really faster. I like that it has this vibrant, energetic sound that rises above a lot of what the 90s punk stuff is. You know, it's not just that kind of nitro melodic skate punk sound. You know, the first verse has some really, really cool picked notes that fill out the sound, since the band is a 3-piece
Mhm.
at the time. You know, it's not like super fast strumming all throughout. It kind of slows down then during the verse, but then it picks up again during the chorus. And I mean, I just imagine a crowd bouncing
Mm.
to this, you know, maybe circle pitting or just bouncing to how upbeat the chorus is. And then that pull off riff that kind of goes down the neck, then comes back up. To me, it kind of sounds like they're lifting again from Metallica, like on Anti-Manifesto, which I think is an homage to And Justice for All. But it sounds so similar to that, but in a way that doesn't sound repetitive. Like, you can hear a little bit of their metal influence coming through, but that's not so on the nose, or that's not so like a clashing of genres or an overlap of genres. Like, it really fits together. But to me, that straight up sounds like late 1980s Metallica.
Dude, it's really interesting that you're saying that you're going there with this, because to me that comes through with Jord also on the drums. So to me, Jord is a thrash drummer that plays single kick and wound up in a punk rock band. Okay. To me, whenever I listen to this song, I imagine that if this song was plunked down in front of Dave Lombardo from Slayer.
Oh yeah.
And you put Dave Lombardo behind a single kick drum set, and Chris started playing this song, that Dave Lombardo would do almost exactly what Jord does on this song. It's got that thrashy, that thrash kick drum beat, which varies tremendously from the kick drum approach of somebody like Eric Sandin from NoFX. Okay. And so like the way Jord plays the song reminds me more of 80s Dave Lombardo on like Behind the Crooked Cross than Eric Sandin on Green Corn. So, and Eric Sandin's Green Corn is still a heavy performance, but like I hear like if there was like I feel like if Dave Lombardo sat down behind Jord's drum set and Chris started playing the song, that Dave would do what Jord does and Eric would not do what Jord does. So the snare fills are sort of like done in like a halting and jarring way, and the kick drum feels far more thrashed than Southern California punk. And like this is what makes these Propaganda early records stand out. Like their sound stands apart from all these other California bands for just some really important reasons. And like their distance from that hotbed scene in California gave them the distance to not be overly or annoyingly inspired by what any of those other bands were doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like all those like post-suffer bands don't sound like Propaganda, and it's literally because of Propaganda's physical distance and because of what they personally enjoyed as musicians. They were metal kids who were really good at playing punk songs and just weren't quite, they didn't have the right voice and they didn't have the right like style or feel to be the thrash band that they wanted to be. But like they worked with what they had and they used their influences, and that distance from the Southern California stuff really made them stand apart, because they were hearing that stuff, but they were also hearing things like SNFU and No Means No. And it's just a really interesting cross section of influences that makes a record like How to Clean Everything or a song like Pigs Will Pay stand out from like that post-suffer Bad Religion, like Southern California scene.
Greg, I honestly don't think I ever thought about the physical isolation as a contributing factor. Like I thought about it in terms of, you know, the influence of metal and the big four of Canadian thrash, or even influence of American thrash that was so popular, but that they don't fall into what becomes essentially an echo chamber of, you know, a formula for punk success. Just imagine, you know, maybe not, how differently they would have sounded had they upended and then moved.
Yeah.
Right? to Southern California,
Mhm.
how drastically different the sound might have been. And I really don't think I put into or I just realized that isolation until now. That's such a good point.
Well, and what's really interesting, I was talking to Steve Vinace for our Let's Talk More Rock anniversary bonus episode the other day.
You mean my future replacement?
Oh yeah. Keith's fired, everybody. Steve, you're in. So anyway, when Chris was recording How to Clean Everything, he told Steve that he was being pressured to sing like that. Like, so if you listen to the martial law demo version of Pigs Will Pay, like it's a little less of that. It's like a little less of that How to Clean Everything snot, because like he was kind of being encouraged and pushed vocally in that direction because, you know, commercial viability, punk rock success, et cetera, having a certain attitude about you.
I can't imagine that being successful.
I know. So when
oh boy, that's so funny.
I know. And when they were in California, like recording, like they were being encouraged to, you know, perform in a certain way. Like I'm speculating here. I'm not saying this is exactly what happened, right? I obviously wasn't there. But, you know, if you're with somebody and they're encouraging you to do a certain thing and it winds up being 10% more of that snarl, that's 10% more of the snottiness that How to Clean Everything is so known for compared to the other records. But then you go far, far away, all of a sudden all that peer pressure disappears.
Yeah.
Right. If you go far, far away and it's the 90s and not everybody's attached to their Instagram feed 24/7, you can't continue that vocal peer pressure. So like Chris would become more natural being far away, which is, you know, maybe what leads to the shift in the How to Clean, in the Let's Talk More Rock sound. So, I mean, as far as the vocal performance on this song, I actually really like the vocal performance.
Yeah, same.
Quite a lot better than
same.
almost all of How to Clean Everything. It's crazy. It's really such a huge bummer this song isn't on the album, because Chris did a really awesome job on this song, and the song is way better than the following songs. It's better than This Might Be Satire.
Yes.
It's better than I Want You to Want Me.
True.
It's better than Ska Sucks.
Check.
And I'm going to light some fires here.
Oh boy.
It is better than Head, Chest, or Foot. It's better than Showdown, and it's better than Haile Selassie. So if you take that into consideration, if this were on this record, this would be a top 50% song for me. And I understand it was held to make the 7-inch a special release, but geez Louise, this song got the shaft, in my view. So do you have anything else about music that you want to talk about?
No, Greg, I think we can move ahead to the lyrics.
Awesome. Well, the lyrics are great on this song. It's a fantastic anti-police brutality song that is now almost 3 decades old, and as propaganda is wont to do, they only become more relevant with age.
Right.
And we can see it with so much hindsight and what has happened with regards to the lack of reforms in policing, including the live streaming of murders via body cams and via Facebook Live and everything that's been used. I'm thinking of the Philando Castile murder on that one. But when Sue Lynn and I were recording the Dead Fascist interview portion of that episode, Sue Lynn went to a lot of the protests last summer in New York City when George Floyd was killed, when Breonna Taylor was killed. And it was at the height of when the U.S. was racked with the pandemic. Still are, but last summer was particularly horrendous because when people were out protesting in the streets against the murder of these unarmed people, people were saying, well, are you going to protest? There's a pandemic, isn't there? So there's all this like, you know, there's all these critiques of people going up protesting because of the pandemic. It's like, oh, now we're going to use this as a pandemic excuse.
Yeah, I can't watch my football, but you get to go to a protest. Like,
exactly. That was
what about that didn't even make sense. Sure.
Murder. We're talking about murders here, people. And so, you know, it was just gut wrenching. And this gut wrenching return to the world after being locked down in the US for a few months. Like no one's out. Everybody's in their houses, depending where in the country you live, of course. Where I lived, no one was out because we took it seriously. There's a madman in the White House tweeting incessantly about hydroxychloroquine and, you know, enraging the nation, sending tweets every 20 minutes to further divide us. And then Floyd is murdered, Taylor is murdered, and there is these national protests which make the news all over the world. And I'm remembering the imagery of that, man. I've been having flashbacks of this today.
Gosh. Greg, I had so many nights I stayed up till 4 a.m. live streaming from Unicorn Riot, just watching awful, terrible abuses of power and authority in ways that were worse than anything I could imagine in a movie.
Yeah.
It was so perfect. Like somehow, like given what I know about American history, like not unexpected, but at the same time, I still couldn't believe what I was seeing.
So dark, so dark. And like, I'm thinking about some of the ones that spring to mind for me is like watching the protests in Manhattan and like seeing the police, the NYPD SUVs ramming the SUVs through people and like through barriers against people. And that just really in my mind, the police here in Buffalo pushing Martin Gugino to the ground and fracturing his skull. Dude's 75, giving a helmet back to the riot police because they're all dressed like they're in freaking, some kind of major bombing campaign somewhere in the world where we bomb people and, take their oil and call it freedom. But like, I'm just thinking about these things and like, there's these visuals that are coming back from my life. Like, you remember like 10 years ago, the Occupy protests at the University of California, Davis, where the officer just like pepper sprays a row of like 19-year-olds who are sitting arms locked on a sidewalk at like under the order of the chancellor, who then comes out and like walks past them and like everybody like is like staring at her. And she's like ordering these cops to pepper spray everybody. And then I pictured that, man, I accidentally watched that Derek Chauvin criminal murdering self kneeling down on George Floyd for over 9 minutes. I watched that video for a few minutes and I was like, I can't believe what I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
It's indicative of a culture of people who are alleged to serve and protect, but who are trained to kill and told to be ready to kill. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what the song is about and the gist of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Greg, but geez, I think before I shared too many of my own ideas, though you've provided, I think, ample caveats already. I just want to try to preface a few things that I'm going to say again, that there's just no way to address everything that needs to be mentioned in a conversation about a song about police violence. And it reminds me actually of what you mentioned during Humane Meat, that you said something like, no matter what, we were probably going to disappoint some listeners, for whichever reason, if it was, individuals who are omnivores or individuals who are vegan. But here I feel like maybe some might be angry that we talk about this too much, but probably far more likely that we don't say enough, or that we're not harsher in our language, that our words and condemnations aren't going to be strong enough. So I just want to reiterate that what I share is simply the thoughts and reflections I've had while thinking about the song this week. And by no means are they intended to be the final say on the issue.
Yeah.
I encourage people to share their thoughts, their own stories, their suggested readings, their podcasts, any of those things with me. And as I tell my students on a weekly basis, I'm no expert.
Yeah.
I'm just sharing what I know and think about this content as of right now. And I'm still reading, I'm still learning, and I'm still, maybe most importantly, unlearning.
Yeah.
But with that, I want to share the first lyric. It says, thought, word, and deed once sloganeered, a reaction undefined, the battle hymn, the mantra of a once unfocused mind, but as logic tempered anger, still inspired, but now informed. And man, these opening lines they sharply challenge, I think, the slogans and phrases that have risen in response to police violence or news stories or symbols and phrases, all forms of propaganda, the uncritically the media that uncritically advances a police department's image or helps undermine reform efforts, media and messages that simplify policing into an issue of good guys versus bad guys. So I like how this is not just talking about police, but talking about how the people respond to the police. And I think that that's an important thing to reflect on ourselves as individuals. So I can't tell our listeners or you what to think about, but I can just ask you, Greg, like to think about all the ways you've been programmed to revere, but also to just submit. You know, I grew up in a household where Adam 12, Dragnet, Cops, and then later on Law and Order, those things were always on.
Yep, me too.
Or in my elementary school, we had the officer friendly program. I mean, for a while when I was a kid, I thought like every cop was named officer friendly because I knew like 3 of them at different schools. I'm like, wow, are you guys related? I didn't realize that it was a program designed to get kids to think better about cops. And maybe for some friends who aren't familiar with this, local police would give presentations at schools. They'd bring coloring books and stickers and have like these crafted images and stories and narratives that unquestioningly perpetuate the good guys in blue rhetoric. Or now the propaganda is far more mainstream. It's often partisan, and it's almost always now, interestingly, marketable. The thin blue line flags, the Blue Lives Matter yard signs, the Punisher skull t-shirts and bumper stickers, which fellow Hoosier Nate Powell addresses in his comic About Face, which if you've not read that from Popula, you can read it now. If you're listening and you're like, I've not read that, you should 100% hit pause and go read that now. Nate Powell is the artist who's probably most known for the artwork behind the March graphic novel series about the lives of John Lewis. Yeah, he's also super into punk.
Those are amazing.
Yeah.
Nate Powell, come on the podcast.
Yeah. So he addresses how, you know, like police adopting the Punisher skull is equal parts dystopian. It's illiterate. It's oblivious and like sadly ironic. Even Gary Conway, the creator of the Punisher, he told Forbes magazine, the Punisher is representative of the failure of law and order to address the concerns of people who feel abandoned by the legal system. It always struck me as stupid and ironic that members of the police are embracing what is fundamentally an outlaw symbol. But that's the point, I think. And it's right out in front of our eyes that the police are outlaws. They're above the law. And service too often is not about community. It's not about the Constitution, but rather about unmitigated, unchallenged power. And this new round of imagery and symbolism that's been whipped up, crazily enough, paints police both as like heroes and victims, as defenders of law and order, but also as rebels. It shows them as like equally martyrs and gladiators. And the hardest part is that anyone who questions the disparities in arrest, in policing, shootings, or suggests any hint in wanting accountability or reform, those people are automatically strawmanned as being anti-police, therefore anti-American. And Greg, I just caught an interview on NPR last week with a staff member from the Marshall Project who summarized like some of these things, especially with the thin blue line. He says that this stems from the 20th century as police departments increasingly come to see themselves as kind of quasi-military institutions.
Yeah.
A lot of former military people who served in Vietnam and Korea came back and take jobs as police officers. And at that time, you see increasing references to the thin blue line, this idea that they separate order from chaos. And where abroad, that meant they're the front line of America fighting its enemies around the world. Now the idea is the enemy is within.
Yep.
The enemy is criminals and elements of disorder that seek to sort of undermine American society. So addressing those images that are far more pervasive, and they are everywhere. They're on my students' backgrounds on their iPads, the Punisher skull with the blue line or the thin blue line flag. I think the language, the rhetoric, those things that we craft in response to that is so incredibly important. And I think that includes what the band is saying here, how we respond by saying pigs will pay, and we'll get to it even more. But being critical of that as well, in a response to these far more like harmful and dangerous and insidious and unconstitutional trends that eventually just become like, well, if you don't like it, don't commit a crime.
Exactly. It's so reductive. And, this is a really interesting line to me as well, because it's sort of like a puzzle, because you really have to think about what Chris is saying here. It's not completely obvious what he means.
Mm-hmm.
Like on the original version from the demo lyrics, it's a linear story, right?
Right.
This one, it's got a lot more nuance to it. And the battle hymn mantra of cops, to learning how to speak cop lingo, walk like cops, talk like cops, think like cops. How does that occur, right? What kind of training does it take to take a specific kind of person and get them to be like a cop, so that if they walk into a room, it feels like the cops are there, right? If you put me in a cop uniform,
yeah,
dude, you put me in a cop uniform, I would walk into a room and people would look at me and I would just start laughing like my head off. And people would be like, oh, that guy's like wearing a cop uniform that he rented from like a costume store, right? Like it would be completely obvious instantly that I am not actually a cop, even if I had the full get up head to toe.
Strippers here.
So like, exactly. Yeah. It would be that much of a joke, right? I would walk in and people would start laughing at me because they would know instantly. Cause I just don't have that thing, right?
Sure.
I don't have that mystique or whatever. And, I feel like so many cops I've ever talked to have been like suspicious of everybody. Like they go into a conversation and their default mode is, I am suspicious of you. And then they wonder why they can't have a real relationship or a real conversation with people. Like they put off a tone. I'm not saying all cops. I don't know. I've never met all of the police, right? But like the conversations that I've had with police, it feels like I'm literally being suspected of something from step one, before a word even comes out of my mouth. Like the first word is a suspicious tone from the cop to me. I got pulled over for having my cell phone in my hand last Christmas time, and it wasn't on, but it was in my hand, and New York is very strict about that. So I got pulled over, and the tone right away is one of suspicion. You had your phone out, you were texting. And I was like, I wasn't texting, it wasn't on, but like I was immediately on the defensive.
Yeah, combative.
And that is a strategy for communication that is employed from step one, so that immediately the citizen is on their back foot. Like they're immediately backed into a corner from word one. So how do you get people to do that, right? How do you turn a normal person into somebody who takes every conversation and puts a person on their back foot from word one? I am not capable of that. Like I'm just kind of a warm person, right? I couldn't do it. So the words once unfocused mind are crucial to me, because it's so interesting, because it alludes to a sort of average intellect person being brought in, programmed, put onto the streets, highly armed with tactical equipment, body armor, an incredibly powerful vehicle, the ability to drive 100 miles an hour anywhere you want to go, the ability to drive slowly right behind people to mess with their heads while knowing that the person is looking at you in their rearview mirror, scared to death you're going to pull them over for going 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, before suddenly taking an exit and giving that person like almost like a heart attack on their way to work in the morning.
Right.
You have the ability to pull people over for having air fresheners hanging in their rearview mirror. You have the ability to watch people squirm at your presence. That's power, man. Give an unfocused person an ideology to cling to, turn them into a cop, put it in their brains how important they are, and watch them go all in. Like, same with fraternities. Like, I had friends who went away to college as one person that I had known my whole life. And then 3 months later, they come back at Thanksgiving break from their university, and literally every other word out of their mouth is, "I'd die for my brothers." It's the same thing. Like, give the people grasping for purpose a purpose and watch them twist themselves into pretzels to go through these hoops to make that happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what's interesting, Greg, is that I think you and I actually read this first line very differently. And if I didn't, I want to clarify, like, I actually think the first line's Chris is talking about himself.
Okay.
Like, I think he's
he's the unfocused mind.
Yeah. Like, I think like a reaction undefined is saying the pigs will pay. I think that's the mantra of him as an unfocused mind, as an angry person, but not an informed person. But later he learned more, and he's saying like he's still inspired, but now he knows a little bit more. And I want to tweak what I was saying previously when, calling police officers pigs or writing the first version of this song. So when I mentioned like about the rhetoric and the language and the response to the propaganda that is so, widely accepted, it's that it's almost like I hear the band saying here, we have to refine our message in a way that's far more focused, it's far more logical, it's more meaningful, and it's actually productive, rather than just saying, "You pigs will pay."
Yeah, nice. Oh, I like that. I love how music does this, how you can take two people, put the same song in front of them, and then they read something in entirely different manners. That's the best part about this show, man. I love this stuff. That's why you could never do a show like this by yourself.
No way.
You know what I mean? Like, I have my other podcast where I just talk to one person per episode and I'm the only host. And like, it's a totally different thing. I could never do this like that. Like, I would be so far out of my element, and like I would feel so lost trying to do a show like this by myself. But anyway, so we have the next line. I want to know what you think about it. Morality enforcement based on the interest of a state coerced into concordance and threatened into place.
I'm actually going to go back one.
Oh, sure.
It reads, "The pigs we'd turned to caricature become far worse than we'd warned." And that's what makes me think that about that first line, that it's actually talking about themselves. And Greg, we've mentioned Kathleen Belew's book, Bring the War Home, a few times already.
I'm reading it right now.
Yeah, but awesome. Something that really comes to mind from her research for me is that she argues how wrong the media got white supremacists, depicting them as isolated, ignorant, uninformed, backwards rednecks. And in that same way, I think this here, like the character of the pig, the donut eating, out of shape, painfully unintelligent Chief Wiggum, for example, from The Simpsons. But 20% of police officers are veterans, despite only 6% of the US population actually serving. So there's far higher concentration there. And just think about the training skills, experiences, worldviews, killologies, as you mentioned previously, that go along with that. So I think it's important in thinking about and crafting that message in those whatever names or responses. And a few other things that I found somewhat related to this, Greg, is that the first citywide police force in LA in the late 1800s, it was the Los Angeles Rangers. They wore no uniforms, but they had a white ribbon until eventually they were outfitted with surplus Union Army uniforms left over from the Civil War. And I say that because, Greg, just think of the evolution of police officer uniforms since you were a kid.
Oh, man.
I mean, for me in Indiana, it's been a slow creep from that like a light blue version of a Barney Fife uniform.
Sure, it's the short sleeve, button up
Right.
shirt, khaki
Kind-
pants,
kind of baggy,
shiny shoes. The shoes
Yeah.
were shiny.
until eventually everything being solid dark navy or just
Yep.
straight up black.
Yep.
Foreboding, uninviting. To me, it screams more like everyone is in the SWAT team rather than like someone serving their community.
Yep.
And that's just the uniforms. If we say pigs as some, like, think of the other generalizations and stereotypes about pigs, even if inaccurate, right? That they're lazy, they're unintelligent, they're slovenly. Again, not actual representations of the animals, but look beyond the uniforms. Our listeners have probably heard about the Defense Department program called the 1033, that it sent $7 billion worth of excess military equipment to over 8,000 local law enforcement agencies across the country, including the Los Angeles School District, which has a tank. Like the Los Angeles School Police Department had rocket launchers until 2014.
Oh,
right?
Lord have mercy. Reminds me of the Columbia Missouri Police Department, town of 100,000 people with a college in it. And like they have like the most insane SWAT tactical vehicles ever. The garage at the police department is terrifying.
Yeah. So we have this language of kind of animal, equating with an animal, unthreatening, like a pig is not going to threaten me, right? In real life, if I were to be around a pig, that would not threaten me. But the language hasn't kept up with the actual threats that police pose in daily life on a daily basis in communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and speaking of, the animal pig, I was thinking today that, oh yeah, the pigs were in charge in Orwell's Animal Farm. That was kind of an interesting little thing that popped up into
right.
my mind as well. But dude, you bring up that uniforms over the eras, and cops are just scary. They're just scary now. Like when I was a little kid and we had like our dare officer, like in the school and stuff, it was like this like short, bald, overweight guy who was like, just like, hey kids, how's it going? We're all like, oh, hey, how's it going? But man, I saw cops in the schools that I've taught in over the years. I've seen cops body slam people. I've seen cops like arresting and like dragging kids out of the school that I worked in handcuffs. I've seen cops going through like lockers and vehicles and like searching cars like in the parking lot, like as kids were trying to leave school. It's scary stuff, man. They're scary people. And, I don't know. So anyway, so what do you think about this, the morality enforcement on the interests of the state coerced into concordance and threatened into place? What do you think about that line?
Well, I don't have any specific like personal thoughts or breakdowns, but what I thought of, or at least what I found, Greg, is from the Hamilton Project. It says 10 economic facts about crime and incarceration in the United States. And I want to think about that in terms of like contrasting how we view police as some, protector of a community or the upholder of law and order, with some details here from the Hamilton Project. I'm going to read 10 things. It says, number one, crime rates have steadily declined over the past 25 years. Number two, low income individuals are more likely than higher income individuals to become victims of crime. Number three, the majority of criminal offenders are younger than the age of 30. Number four, disadvantaged youths engage in riskier criminal behavior. Number five, federal and state policies have driven up the incarceration rate over the past 30 years. Number six, the U.S. incarceration rate is more than 6 times typical of a modern developed nation. Number seven, there is nearly a 70% chance that an African-American man without a high school diploma will be imprisoned by his mid-30s. Number eight, per capita expenditures on corrections more than tripled over the past 30 years. Number 9, by their 14th birthday, African American children whose fathers do not have a high school diploma are more likely than not to see their fathers incarcerated. And number 10, juvenile incarceration can have lasting impacts on a young person's future. And I share those things because I think all of that clearly represents the purpose, function, and system in place of policing and incarceration is not in the interests of the people they pretend to serve.
I agree. And if you think about stupid menial things like people who have done many years in prison for things like having marijuana, cannabis, right? And you look at these national widespread legalization efforts to, decriminalize that in, almost every state at this point. And think about all those people who had their, heads slammed into the pavement while being arrested for, being, accused of being some kind of drug kingpin throughout the last several decades for things like marijuana, which are clearly going to be legal. I mean, you have the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, like John Fetterman, who is out there, making the case. You have John Boehner, former U.S. House of Representatives, Speaker of the House, sitting on the board of cannabis companies now. Think about how many people did decades in prison for that stuff, man.
Right.
Like, so many lives ruined forever. So when you think about morality enforcement, you have all this racist policy that led to the illegalization of things like marijuana in the first place. And, how many people were targeted because of that. And then you think about the crack epidemic in the 1980s and how Reagan was so involved in, cracking down. The terrible wording, terrible phrasing, but, just over policing and over imprisoning and the, 3 strikes things. And it's just wild how many lives have been ruined. And while I sit in my completely comfortable house and, go about my completely boring existence, and how many people have been just completely terrorized from the time they were small children because of the community that they happened to be born into just out of sheer dumb luck.
Right.
And how easily that could have been me, how easily my face could have been smashed in the pavement because I was with a friend who had marijuana, but how that just wasn't my fate, just out of things that were completely out of my control, advantages I didn't earn, advantages I didn't ask for. And because of those advantages that I didn't earn or ask for, I did not get my face slammed into the pavement or imprisoned for many years for something ridiculous,
Yeah.
Ugh. So that's the morality enforcement aspect for me. But then we have this, it's not just, this is a hilarious line, by the way. It's not just isolated incidents of cop jocks kicking ass. That's so good.
Let's bring back cop jocks, please.
I know, right? It's better than soldier cops. It's better than war zone cops. Oh, man. And then we have the line, it's a fucking war machine protecting the wealth of the employing class. So listen, man, I live in a rich suburb of Buffalo. It's a nice neighborhood in a first ring suburb. I pay through the nose to live here, but almost nobody that I've talked to in my town thinks the cops are on anyone's side but the cops' side, right? Who I don't know in my suburb? I don't know the ultra rich of my suburb, and there are ultra rich. I run past their houses frequently because it's whoa, I wonder what their lives are like, where you can afford to live in a house that has $14,000 a year in property taxes, what that lifestyle might be like. You know what I mean? And then I think about that as I run past, and then I'm like, la-di-da, that'll never be me. Thank God. I don't want to live like that. But anyway, I don't know the super rich in my suburb. I know a bunch of regular people doing their best to get their bills paid and their kids to school every day. And none of us feel like the cops are on our side. Moments ago, about 10 guys on motorcycles drove, I'm not even joking, like 90 miles an hour down my street. And there's no point in even telling the cops because we all know that nothing would happen. Like they don't pull people over for reckless endangerment in neighborhoods. Like all that we can tell that they do is, just sit in the middle of the highway median and like pull people over and like harass people on the highway. And like, we don't know what we do with their insane war chest budget in this town. And like another thing is like the tactical gear investments that I talked about earlier, like mid-sized and small cities are making their towns like buy huge armored trucks for towns with a population of like 10,000 people. School district has a tank, you said. Like that's crazy. The gross expenditures on gear, money, weapons, like it's out of control because it just makes people in town feel like hostages when convoys of black SUVs that look like they're like literally Secret Service driving around town instead of like what used to be like the normal like Crown Vic cop car. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. It was like the same version of something my grandparents would drive.
Dude.
Like a town car.
Yeah. And like the town where I used to live in Columbia, Missouri, every cop has like a massively decked out Yukon. And they are like so terrifying. The windows are completely blacked out. The word police on the side of the car is in flat black against the shiny black paint job. I mean, it is like a war vehicle. Like it looks like it would be like on a movie where like the Secretary of State was being driven in like an armored car across a war zone in like Afghanistan. Like that's what these cop cars look like in Columbia, Missouri, where Mizzou is, like where they have an SEC football team. Like that's what their cop cars look like. It's crazy.
Well, that isolated incidents line, Greg, just think of how many terrible analogies you've heard with like, it's only a few bad apples, forgetting the meaning of the entire phrase.
We talked about that last week on the Victory Lap episode too.
That they spoil the whole bunch, like the closer an apple is to rot, the more rot spreads.
Yeah.
One spoiling apple in a crisper drawer or a fruit bowl or a storage barrel, this is someone else's words here, or a cross-country shipping container, or even still hanging on the bow, speeds the rot of every apple it touches in, even if one of it doesn't touch. So it's insane, like these excuses that we come up with and these languages that we try to apologize for and forgive the people who actively reject and deny individuals' identities and rights and freedoms, to apologize for them. So I think all of this is to say that modern policing and more incarceration, it's pretty clear it does not make us safer. I mean, Greg, there are arrests. There's an arrest every 3 seconds in the United States, and 5% of those arrests are for violent crimes. 80% are for low-level offenses, and 25% of crimes are solved by arrest. That's it. So I read something else from Dr. Kapler from a university in Kentucky. It says, while the average officer would have made about 14 arrests in 2011, less than one of these arrests would have been for a violent crime, and fewer than 2 arrests would have been for property crimes. In fact, 12 of the arrests made by our average police officer would have been for petty crimes like minor drug or alcohol possession, disorderly conduct, and vandalism. These figures, like the research on police activity, suggest that police work involves far less crime fighting than one might expect. I saw something else, a report which includes a chart of the total crime rate versus the incarceration rate in the US from 1950 to 2010. And the crime rate and incarceration rate almost overlap in the 1950s and 60s. Then the crime rate jumps in the early 1960s. The incarceration rate lags behind until the mid 70s. Then you have the crime rate peaking around 1991, and it's actually fallen ever since then, with a plateau in the mid 90s. But around 1995, the incarceration rate crossed over and surpassed the crime rate and has climbed with just a few dips ever since. And those dips, experts argue, are a result of policy changes, court orders, and sentencing reduction for crimes, not prison. Like, prison is not a deterrence to crime. Something else I read from the Equal Justice Initiative, that the United States spent nearly $33 billion on incarceration in 2000 for roughly the same level of public safety that it achieved in 1975, in which it spent $7.4 billion. I mean, these things just kind of baffle me. You know, I read in the New York Times, prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she explains that abolition means not just closing of prisons, but the presence of, instead of, vital systems of support that many communities lack. Instead of asking how in a future without prisons we will deal with so-called violent people, abolitionists ask how we resolve inequalities and get people the resources they need long before the hypothetical moment when they mess up. And I really strongly encourage our listeners to check out her 2-part interview on the Intercepted podcast, which offers as like an intro to the ideas of abolition. And related to that, Greg, and the reimagining of how we assess how communities in which we live predict the outcomes of our lives, like you said, like by sheer dint of luck, by the fact that, you know, where you live and where I live, we don't have to experience these things. The families we're born into, the communities in which we inhabit. A report from the Vera Institute of Justice concludes that prison is, I'll read this as a quote here, an expensive way to achieve less public safety, but it may actually increase crime by breaking down the social and family bonds that guide individuals away from crime, removing adults who would otherwise nurture children, depriving communities of income, reducing future income potential, and engendering a deep resentment toward the legal system. So where do we go from here? I don't know. Like, we have like symbolic events now. Like, I felt terrible that I celebrated the guilty verdicts because I'm celebrating something that was only caused by the murder of a person in the first place.
Exactly.
Like, accountability, though, isn't justice. And
Mhm.
like the George Floyd Act, it seeks to ban racial profiling and overhaul qualified immunity for police and ban the use of chokeholds, but that wouldn't have saved George Floyd's life, the abolitionist and human rights lawyer Derica Purnell argues. So I don't know where we go from here. I'll share just a couple other things from some reform goals from the Sentencing Project, which isn't just about, you know, like, it's so easy to think of Band-Aid solutions that don't fix the systemic inequalities of between communities and also between the policing of different communities. So the Sentencing Project says eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and cutting back on excessively lengthy sentences, for example, by imposing a 20-year maximum on prison terms, shifting resources to community-based prevention and treatment for substance abuse, investing in interventions that promote strong youth development and respond to delinquency in age-appropriate and evidence-based ways, examining and addressing the policies and practices, conscious or not, that contribute to racial inequity and at every stage of the justice system. And then the last one, removing barriers that make it harder for individuals with criminal records to turn their lives around. I mean, every single one of those almost just seems like what a logical, rational society would do.
Yeah, we're not a logical, rational society, though. At least I don't believe we are. Like, I'm to that point, man, where we do so many things that are the polar opposite of reason and logic and sense in my limited understanding of the way a society can be, that I've given up hope in calling us a reasonable, rational, logical society. Can we get there? Yeah. Are we there now? Heck no. But like, I also wanted to plug that End of Policing book again by Alex Vitale, because he has a lot of really amazing details in there about where we can go from here. And he has practical things that people can do if they actually want to do more than sit at their home caring about this, but having no freaking clue how they can be a part of any kind of change. The End of Policing is a good resource. But something else that really stands out to me about this song is this closing line. You'll pay for the guns that you've used, the minorities you've abused. You'll pay for the blood that you've spilled, and the innocent or guilty, for that matter, people that you've killed. And it is the same line from the demo version. Chris retained this closing verse, which is pretty cool, I think, because he read it and he stood by it. And to me, the core of this closing line is you'll pay. Now, I read this line in a couple of different ways. Obviously, maybe he's saying that he's going to make the cops literally pay for their crimes, right? Holding people accountable for the terror that they inflict. That's one way of reading this line. Another way is thinking about who is the you in you'll pay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And to me, that you is me.
Yep.
I am going to pay because I am literally paying property taxes on my house, which then go to fund police departments. So if a city police officer where I pay property taxes murders somebody, and then my town has to pay restitution and damages to the family of the murdered person, that is the money that I gave my city to pay somebody to kill somebody, who then has to then pay the family for the person who has been murdered, which no amount of money can replace, because those people are going to suffer from serious depression and loss and trauma forever. Right? And so, like, you pay for cops in your town. If you pay property taxes in a town, you pay for the cops. So if you own a home, depending on your city, you pay for cops. So you pay the salary of people who murder. You pay the salary of people who take Dave Grossman's Killology seminars. If you live in a town, I think that you should write to your city and say that Dave Grossman Killology seminars should be banned from your police departments. You're not going to pay property taxes for these people to get trained literally to murder. Like, that is something that I feel like I need to personally do myself.
Yeah. That's a great starting point. Yeah.
And when cities have cop misconduct on their hands nonstop, it winds up being a massive suck of financial resources that taxpayers will never see benefits from. You know what I mean? In the last 10 years, what the city of Chicago has paid in damages for misconduct cases? $500 million. Since 2010, the city of Chicago has paid $500 million in misconduct payouts. Mike Brown's family got $1.5 million. Laquan McDonald's family got $5 million. Philando Castile's got $3 million. Chicago awarded Jacques Rivera $17 million after he spent 20 years wrongfully convicted in prison. Like, that's taxpayer money. We're not getting bridges for that money. We're not getting rail for that money. We're not getting climate change, infrastructure for that money. We're not getting schools. We're not getting health services. We're getting literally nothing except a dead person. That is crazy. So, like, whenever it talks about the war machine, that to me also speaks to the damage that war leaves behind. When a war happens, what is left over? Bombed off buildings with rebar sticking out and rubble, right? What happens when we have this kind of war we have to spend a bunch of money and resources paying for the deaths of these people, and we don't get the services that we thought we were paying for, right? When you pay property taxes, you are supposed to get services for that. That's how taxes are supposed to work. But if a city spends all their money paying out to families for the cops who are, committing appalling acts on people they're allegedly serving, that's a massive misuse of taxpayer dollars, which is super ironic considering who you think is so obsessed with how our taxpayers' money is getting used. We get, if you think about who in Congress is talking about, abuse of taxpayer funds, those are the people that really, really support the police as well. And the police are committing acts which are causing millions upon millions upon millions of lost taxpayer dollars. Yeah, and like the song sings about innocent people, but the lyrics also say guilt for that matter too, which I just want to point out that I love the fact that he sings innocent people you've killed, but then in the lyrics, he's also writing and guilty for that matter too. Even if they are guilty, you get to take their life without a trial in the middle of the street in broad daylight. That's how you're going to treat like a person, like a human being who is like just as much alive as you. That's what they get. I don't know, man. It makes me sick.
Right. And going back to what you said about taxpayers, it's also the same people who like to pontificate about the Constitution and people's protections. And of course, like the Second Amendment matters, but not the Fifth here. Like due process and legal protections for those individuals accused or suspected of a crime. But I want to go back to the pronouns, because if it just said at the end, you'll pay again, like in the original version, I don't know if I would like the song as much. Even if it were kind of like a fantasy or this sort of like metaphysical, possibly haunting story of a victim or someone wishing some change or reform or revenge, whatever. But the fact that it says you'll pay for the guns they've used, now the band is talking to the audience.
Yep.
It's not just us against them. It's what are you allowing to happen in this in the first place? And that just elevates this song from an angry punk rock anti-police screed, which can seem so predictable. Right. But to now a call to drastically reimagine society and the systems in place that guarantee that our lives will be unequal, like to challenge those things. And I've referenced my second favorite band, Misery Index, the Death Grind band, a lot already. And they have a song on the album called Traitors. There's a song called Black Sides, and it addresses the extraordinary rendition, the abduction and extrajudicial transfer of people from another country to another in hopes of avoiding laws to limit interrogation, detention, and torture. But there's a lyric in that song that says, "The work of death carried out in all our names again." And Greg, we could run through a ton of statistics and staggering numbers about our financial complicity. How our money keeps this system of violence and oppression in place. I mean, you mentioned the $500 million in Chicago. I found something else from 538. They obtained records from 31 of 50 different cities with the highest police civilian ratios in the country. And their analysis showed that the cities have paid, those cities, that's 31 cities, have paid $3 billion to settle misconduct lawsuits in the same 10 years. And I guess rather than just reading off a litany of statistics, but it's what we could do instead is, well, for me, I want to challenge myself then to hold police accountable with the money that they get from me. But like you said, like to say, like, is this used? And if so, like, don't. And
like, did I buy a tank? That's what I want to,
right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, what am I actually like if you break down the percentage of money that I pay into taxes. I'm wondering like what percentage of my money, like, have I bought like guns?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? That's what I want to know. Like, what have I bought?
What part of my money has gone for the training or the coffee at the seminar for a killology conference, or for the weapons that are used, whatever, like being more informed of that, but also then holding that accountable and making other community members aware of this, because I think so much of it is not being informed, but also then using more of the money that I can to counter this in ways by trying to lift up communities near me that receive the fist, right? But they don't get a helping hand.
Yeah, dude, they're like a mile away too. You know what I mean? Like that's like whenever I think of where I am in Buffalo, a mile toward the city, that's where the fist is, dude. It's a mile away from my house. It's right there.
Hammond, Gary, East Chicago, that's all right next to me. Those are the places where you don't get a helping hand, you get a fist.
Yeah. And, you know, you just mentioned accountability, and like there is no comprehensive government data on the topic of police brutality leading to the death of American citizens. So accountability is hard to track. An independently compiled database that I found that more than 1,000 people died as a result of police harm in 2019. That's the most recent one I was able to find. The researchers included deaths known to be caused by police, like being shot or beaten or restrained or intentionally hit by a police vehicle or pepper sprayed or tasered or otherwise on or off duty. So that's 1,000 people in 2019. So people from across the country have died in police shootings as well, which does not include other forms of police violence listed above. So this is some of the shooting data. 26% were Black, 18% were Hispanic and Latinx, and 4% were from other racial groups. But Black Americans account for less than 13% of the population, but they are shot and killed by the police at a rate that's over twice as high as white Americans are. And in fact, people of color were more likely to be victims of police harm in 2019 than they were in 2014. So it's getting worse. And in 2019, 54% of those who died as a result of this harm and whose race was identified were people of color, including Asian, Black, Latinx, Native, and Pacific Islander, compared to 50% in 2014. So despite the increased attention, only about 1% of police officers involved with these deaths are charged with a crime, and even less are convicted. So Derek Chauvin's conviction is so unbelievably rare, like according to the data that I'm finding, that's why I think that last week I feel like everybody in the country was totally convinced that Derek Chauvin would walk. I certainly was not expecting conviction on all three accounts. I listened to that live on the radio and I was like, wait, what? You know what I mean? I was completely shocked that he got prosecuted for it and that he actually was convicted. But, you know, white supremacy has no place in the criminal justice system or anywhere else. Like Black Lives Matter every second, every minute, every hour of every day. And, you know, last we were recording during the jury deliberation of Chauvin's trial, who has since been found guilty for George Floyd's murder. And the rest of the cops on duty that day are still awaiting their trials right now. And my hunch is that they will not be convicted. I think that Chauvin is going to be the only actual conviction. And I think he'll probably get out in like 5 years, maybe 7. But, you know, the rest of the cops on duty that day are still awaiting trial. But so many people have lost their lives at the hands of cops in this country. It is a bafflingly humongous problem. And I have some names to highlight about accountability, because these people have lives that are just as alive as anybody else. And now they are no longer alive for a very particular reason, for a very particular cause. So we have Aisha Hudson, well known in Winnipeg right now, who was 16, who was killed in Winnipeg after a police chase last April. During the pandemic, no charges were filed this past January, which has led to a substantial campaign to get charges filed, which, you know, Chris Hanna's posted about on Twitter a couple of times. Then we have Dante Wright, who's 20, killed by Kim Potter, a 20-plus year veteran, when he was trying to get back in his car after police wanted to detain him on a warrant. The chief and Potter both resigned, and Potter has been charged, right? So then we have 2020, Rayshard Brooks, age 27, was killed after falling asleep in his car at a drive-through. After police woke him up, he attempted to flee, and Officer Garrett Rolfe shot him in the back. Rolfe faces charges of felony murder. Okay. In 2020, down the road from me in Rochester, New York, Daniel Prude, age 41, was experiencing a mental health episode, ran into the street naked, and he was asphyxiated with a spit hood. So he and the officers, they're pending investigation right now. It's being invested by Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. Breonna Taylor, one of the most tragic stories I've ever heard in my freaking life, was asleep at home. And her murderer was fired, but he straight up got away with it. And charges of wanton endangerment were filed, but no charges were filed for the actual killing of Breonna Taylor. Tatiana Jefferson, who's 28, was shot and killed by police in Fort Worth, Texas, through an open window in her home after police were notified that her front door had been left open, and the officer resigned and was indicted on murder charges. So we have an indictment there. Aura Rosser, who's 40, was killed in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 2014 after her boyfriend called the police to remove her from the property. They showed up. She was holding a knife. A cop just straight up shot her. No charges. In 2018, Stephon Clark was shot 20 times in Sacramento, California, in his grandma's backyard while holding a cell phone, and the DA did not file charges. Botham Jean, 26, was shot in Dallas, sitting on his couch, eating ice cream by an off-duty officer who walked into his apartment thinking it was her apartment, confused him allegedly for an intruder, but she was actually in his apartment, and she was sentenced to 10 years. So Philando Castile, 32, pulled over. He informed the officer he had a legal weapon. He was shot. Seconds later, the officer was acquitted. Alton Sterling was killed. No charges. All 6 officers in the killing of Freddie Gray got away with it. Janisha Fonville, age 20, was killed after officers arrived to take her to a mental health facility. No charges were filed. And this is sickening that trained officers can't physically handle people in mental health crises without murdering them. How dare you? This is why Dave Grossman's killology training is so horrendous. People who need actual help just get shot. Eric Garner's killer got away with it. Michelle Cousseau's killer was demoted. Akai Gurley's killer got probation. Gabriela Navarez was killed after officers opened fire on her car after she rammed a patrol car. They got away with it. Tamir Rice was 12 years old, playing in a park. Officer shows up. 2 seconds later, Rice was shot. They got away with it. Darren Wilson got away with it in St. Louis for killing Mike Brown. Tanisha Anderson was killed in Cleveland in 2014. No charges. Others are Jamel Floyd, Sean Monterosa, Justin Howell, and so many more. And so the reason I read all these examples is because some of them have accountability and some of them don't. And so I'm trying to remind myself that perhaps we are moving slowly on the arc of justice, but people are literally losing their lives regularly. So even though we can applaud progress or whatever, freaking Breonna Taylor is 10 years younger than us. You know what I mean? She would very much still be alive and in her prime of life. So even if we celebrate incremental improvements in accountability, people who would very much be alive right now are not.
Yeah. Where's their justice?
Exactly.
Where's their celebration.
And you can't, there's no such thing as justice when people are murdered like this. But that's my thoughts on this song, man. Do you have any other thoughts on any of the lyrics at all?
Well, Greg, I'll just add what I told you before we started recording, that I added a name to the list that you read at the beginning because I found out from a Hillary Clinton campaign video in 2016 that someone I went to elementary school was shot and killed by the police, Dontre Hamilton, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And when they were going through the names that I recognize, Tamir Rice and Freddie Gray, and in the video it said Dontre Hamilton, and it kind of just stopped me because I thought, well, that really takes me back. And I thought, wait a second, and I looked up and unfortunately had somehow missed, even though it had made local news, that this person that I knew, that I was adjacent to, I wouldn't say friend. I invited him to my second grade birthday party because he was one of the most popular people in my second grade class, but he declined. So, someone I knew, but seeing that and seeing that someone who was who suffered from mental health issues, he was a paranoid schizophrenic, according to his family. Police were called by a coffee shop. Since he was sleeping on a park bench in front of it, he was roused to be moved away from sleeping on this bench, and he attacked the police officer, who then shot and killed him. And despite the fact that the police department itself said that this officer had violated their policy in dealing with and working with individuals with mental health issues, hearing the apologism from people I know who knew him, who were willing to say, well, he shouldn't have, right? Where clearly the power and the upper hand was not his, that we're so fast to justify the extinguishing of a life, as you said last week, that our political biases and our worship of authority gets in the way of even for a moment reflecting and mourning the loss of a human being that we knew, right? That's someone that we knew. And that was one that really struck me. And I felt a considerable amount of guilt for not knowing in the first place. The fact that not only do I not have to worry about these things, I didn't even know about it.
Mm-hmm. It's that common. It's that frequent that, like, I could list names for the next 9 hours and we wouldn't even get through all the names. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, I was looking at some YouTube comments on this tune, and I found one from just the other day that says, thinking about this a lot tonight, wonder why, #George Floyd. And that just speaks to the power of a song like this, man. 1993 to 2021. And it's just, the song only gets more powerful when he says it just gets worse in the song, when he's like, they are so much worse than we were told. And it keeps getting worse. Like you mentioned, all these things that just keep getting more and more militarized and violent and confrontational and standoffish. And then the guilt tripping of, if you don't support everything we do, then you're a bad American or whatever. It's crazy, man. Like, so it's crazy about the timeliness of the song. Another comment that I found says, who are the narcs hitting the dislike button?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, I'm just picturing like old people who used to be propaganda fans who did grow up to become police officers going and be like, oh, I used to like this band, but you suck now.
Well, Greg, I'll say too that in a response to that first comment that you read, thinking about this a lot tonight with the #George Floyd, someone responded with, and tonight, the day that Chauvin was convicted. So there was a response to that.
Oh, you found the same comment.
Yeah. And there was a response to it, updating it just this past week. So.
Oh man. Nice. I found a video where somebody put newspapers with headlines of cops who had killed people as like a music video montage with this song underneath it. So somebody made a video for this song with cops who had killed people on headlines of newspapers. I really liked that video. And the comment said, nicely done video for one of the best anti-fascist pig anthems of all time. Another person said, just simply about propaganda, social justice legends. And then another person said, does anybody know why they changed the lyrics to Pigs Will Pay and shorten the whole song by one verse? This is the version of the song I grew up with and remember, talking about the old version.
Right.
So we had a super old school person pop in there as well, which is really cool.
Man in blue, knock me down, said boy, let's have some one. Then my friend, get on your feet and boy, you better run. Let's see if you can resist your bullet and my gun. And you pick will pay in a big way. You pick will pay in a big way. I ran like hell out into the street. Heard that trigger pull, felt that bullet hit my feet. Beat me senseless and held the gun to my head. Last words I heard inside my downward start. I think this one's dead. And you think we'll play in a big way. You think we'll play in a big way. They covered up, they faked the scene and they threw me in the dump. Those boys in blue had really thought they'd won. Don't choke in your donuts, boys, but it's only just begun. 'Cause I'm still alive and I'll be back to see you. Bastards, run! See you run! Fucking run! Do run, run! You pigs will pay in a big way. You pigs will pay in a big way. No paper can save you. Minorities save abuse.
Keith, what is this song? What do you walk away with? Because we've done 2 episodes in a row like this. Victory Lap, we talked about hashtag not all cops. This week we
Right.
talked about this. I mean, so this is a lot of heaviness the last couple weeks.
Well, I'm going to go back to that Misery Index lyric, the work of death carried out in all our names again, but updated. It's the police's work of death is carried out in all of our names again and again. And human beings are killed day after day with the defense of keeping you and me safe, Greg. So how do we divest our support from that? How do we hold police accountable? How do we begin to shift the focus away from property to life?
Mm.
And I don't know, but I know that I'm not afraid to listen to people with quote unquote radical ideas that include defunding and abolishing the police, because for far too long, the opposite end of that debate has had all of the airtime in shaping what I think about police. I'm not afraid to have those notions and assumptions challenged now.
Mm-hmm. For me, this is such a fraught era. I mean, I talk all the time to friends of mine who are older than me back in St. Louis, who say all the time about how overly politicized and how overly like to the extremes we have gone as a nation. And one of my buddies that I used to ride bikes with back in St. Louis, I was talking to him the other day, and he's like 51. And he's like, dude, when I was younger, like, I don't remember, like, none of our parents would sit around watching extreme television for 9 hours a night. He was telling me about the difference of, you know, adults and older people now compared to when he was a kid, and he's just one generation ahead of me. And so he's like, yeah, we're really living in these fraught times. But here's another thing. We must not give up. It's so easy to give up. We must speak clearly, openly, and passionately in an informed manner about this enraging policing culture that we live in every single day. We can be a better place, right? Mustn't we continue trying to improve? I have a young human being that I'm attempting to raise to the best of my ability, as are you, as are many of our listeners. Mustn't we try? Our kids didn't ask to be born. Like, you know what I mean? If I was a kid, I was growing up in this crazy world right now, I would almost be attempted to think about becoming an anti-natalist. Be like, I didn't ask to be born. I'm an anti-natalist, and we must continue trying to bend the arc toward justice. If you look at that list I read of notable cases in the last several years, more convictions seem to be occurring against these criminals. So I get hopeful for change, but then I fall back into my cycle of despair where I realized, why must these people have died in the first place for me to be craving this accountability? And we get a life, a single life, depending on your reviews of religion, of course. People out there may have a different varying view than what I just said. But say, just for the sake of argument here, you get a single attempt here on earth. We're right here, right now. And I just keep thinking about this list of names of people who had the light in their eyes snuffed out for basically no reason. It's unfathomable to have that light in the human eyes. I mean, that to me is the big gift right there, being able to see that in another person, being able to see that light in those eyes. That's a gift. And somebody just wakes up in their house, puts on their military cop uniform, gets in a car, and winds up stealing that light from a person that they're supposed to be serving. I'm like, man, if that isn't the most callous of murders, I don't know what is. You know what I mean? Wearing having a phrase like to serve and protect and taking the light out of the eyes of another human being just in a random occurrence when you don't even have to. Dude, Geronimo Yanez did not have to shoot Philando Castile. Those dudes in, where Tamir Rice was playing, pulled up 2 seconds later, that kid has a bullet in him. These things make no sense. It's just tragedy after tragedy. And before I do the rating of this song, I want to say that on the end of this episode, I am adding a long list of names of unarmed people who were killed by police in the United States between 2009 and today. And that's going to be just after I talk about the end of the episode. So if you stick around after the rating. Keith, do you want to rate this song?
Yeah, Greg, I think this is a smarter song than probably most people who occupied that 90s punk boom probably realized.
Mm-hmm.
I think they probably could have missed some of the points. I would bet that. And it has the veneer of a straight up ACAB song, but it doesn't give the audience the satisfaction of just putting the blame on someone else. It really asks them to examine their reactionary slogans and their languages and how they're responding. And more importantly, the ways that they support police violence that they're not aware of, and how or if they can divest that support. I think this is a really, really great song that I wish was on my radar earlier. I wish it was on How to Clean Everything. I'm going to give it a really solid, even if it doesn't sound like it, I'm going to give it a very strong, powerful 3.
Nice, dude. I'm giving it a 3 too. We're on board with our ratings the last couple of weeks. We're sharing a brain. I'm giving it a 3. It would be a top 50% song on How to Clean Everything. I like the fact that there are 2 totally different versions of this song as well. I was thrilled that Chris had a full done version and then changed it.
Mm-hmm.
I love it because both exist and you can listen to both. I love the fact that there are 2 versions, but man, great song. I'm so pumped by it. It's just, oh, it's so good. I really wish like they would have done like a 7-inch that had like Showdown and This Might Be Satire instead of this song on the 7-inch. Like I wish that they would have kept Showdown off the record, or This Might Be Satire, or both, and just did a standalone 7-inch like with those two songs or something. And then through this and like Government Cartoons and stuff like that, some of those old ones that didn't make the record, I wish they would have rethought. I kind of feel like Propaganda didn't really have as much of a say. Maybe there was a little bit of like guiding on like what was going to like be on the record, because I know that a lot of edits were made, but man, I wish this was on it. God, I would put this one straight up after Anti-Manifesto as track 2 instead of Head, Chest, or Foot.
Yeah.
I would completely feel good about that. So anyway, that's our episode for Pigs Will Pay. Keith, thank you for hanging out with me and doing this. These types of episodes aren't particularly easy, and I know you guys have no idea what goes on behind the scenes on how we pick our songs. But sometimes sometimes we're up for super hard, challenging conversations that take a ton of emotional bandwidth. And this was a hard one though, dude. I was thinking about this all week long, and I'm kind of relieved we're at the end of our conversation,
And as I said before, Greg, if people have other resources,
Yep.
books, articles, podcasts, those things to share, I'm learning and reading and trying to challenge my own assumptions. So please share with us.
Yeah, well, that's our episode for Pigs Will Pay. If you want to find us on Instagram or Twitter, you can find us at PropagandyPod as our username. If you want to email us, you can hit us up at propagandypod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time. David McAtee, George Floyd, Sean Reed, Michael Brent Charles Ramos, Breonna Taylor, Manny Elijah Ellis, Atatiana Jefferson, E.J. Fitzgerald Bradford Jr., Chop Roundtree Jr., Chinedu Okobi, Botham Jean, Antoine Rose, Saheed Vassell, Stefan Clark, Aaron Bailey, Charlena Lyles, Charlena Lyles' unborn child, Jordan Edwards, Chad Robertson, Deborah Danner, Alfred Olongo, Terrence Crutcher, Terrence Sterling, Corin Gaines, Joseph Mann, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Betty Boo Jones, Quintonio LeGrier, Corey Lamar Jones, Jamar O'Neill Clark, Jeremy McDowell, India Kager, Samuel Dubose, Sandra Bland, Brendan Glenn, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Eric Harris, Philip White, Maya Hall, Megan Hockaday, Tony Robinson Jr., Janisha Fonville, Natasha McKenna, Jerame Reed, Rumaine Brisbane, Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, Tanisha Anderson, Dante Parker, Ezell Ford, Michael Brown, John Crawford, Eric Garner, Dontre Hamilton, Victor White, Gabriela Monique Navarez, Yvette Smith, Mackenzie Cochran, Jordan Baker, Andy Lopez, Miriam Iris Carey, Barrington Williams, Jonathan Farrell, Carlos Alsas, Larry Eugene Jackson Jr., Kayam Livingston, Clinton Allen, Kamani Gray, Kayla Moore, Jamal Moore, Johnny Warren, Shelley Fry, Darnisha Harris, Timothy Russell, Melissa Williams, Noel Polanco, Reynaldo Cuevas, Chavez Carter, Alicia Thomas, Chantel Davis, Charmel T. Edwards, Tamon Robinson, Irvin Lee Jefferson, Kendrick McDade, Rakia Boyd, Sharice Francis, Jersey Green, Wendell Allen, Nehemiah Dillard, Dante Lamar Price, Raymond Allen Jr., Manuel Loggins Jr., Ramarley Graham, Kenneth Chamberlain, Alonzo Ashley, Kenneth Harding Jr., Derek Williams, Raheem Brown, Reginald Dowsett, Derek Jones, Danroy Henry Jr., Ayanna Stanley Jones, Stephen Washington, Aaron Campbell, Kwame Carrington, Victor Steen, Shem Walker, and Oscar Grant III. Rayshard Brooks, Carlos Carson, Tony McDade, Ayanna Stanley Jones, John Elliott Neville, Elijah McLean, Sterling Lepre Higgins, Javier Ambler, Aaron Bailey, and Tyree Woodson.